the philosopher who woke from dogmatic slumber. Picture a young man in 18th century Scotland, restless and dissatisfied with the philosophy of his time. The books piled on his desk promise certainty about God, the soul, the nature of reality itself. They speak with confidence about what reason can know, what truths are self-evident, what foundations are unshakable. But as he reads, a question begins to gnaw at him, a question so simple it seems almost childish, yet so profound it will shake the foundations of Western thought. How do we actually know any of this? This is David Hume, and he is about to commit an act of philosophical demolition so thorough that centuries later, Immanuel Kant would credit him with interrupting his own dogmatic slumber. But Hume's destruction is not motivated by nihilism or despair. It springs from intellectual honesty, from a refusal to claim knowledge we do not possess, from a determination to examine the actual workings of the human mind rather than construct elaborate theories about what the mind ought to be able to know. Hume approaches philosophy with a radical empiricism, a commitment to trace all our ideas back to their origins in experience. He asks not what reason tells us must be true, but what experience actually shows us. He examines not what we claim to know with certainty, but how we come to believe what we believe. And what he discovers is both liberating and unsettling. Most of what we take for granted as knowledge rests on foundations far more fragile than we imagine. Born in Edinburgh in 1711, Hume lived in an age of intellectual ferment. Newton had revealed the mathematical order of the physical universe. Locke had begun to examine the workings of human understanding. The scientific revolution had shown that careful observation could overturn centuries of accepted doctrine. Hume inherits this empirical spirit, but pushes it further than his predecessors dared. If we are honest about what experience teaches us, if we refuse to smuggle in assumptions that cannot be justified by observation, what remains of our supposed knowledge? The question is not merely academic. Hume recognizes that how we answer it shapes everything: our science, our morality, our religion, our sense of who we are. If reason cannot prove what philosophers have claimed it can prove, if experience cannot justify the certainty we crave, then we must rebuild our understanding of human nature on more honest foundations. We must acknowledge the limits of what we can know while also recognizing the natural beliefs that guide us, despite their lack of rational justification. What makes Hume's approach revolutionary is his willingness to follow his arguments wherever they lead, even when they lead to conclusions that seem to undermine the very possibility of knowledge. He examines causation and finds no necessary connection between cause and effect, only constant conjunction and the habit of expectation. He looks for the self and discovers only a bundle of perceptions with no underlying substance. He investigates miracles and concludes that testimony can never make a miracle probable. Each analysis strips away another layer of assumed certainty. Yet Hume is no despairing skeptic. He recognizes that philosophical doubt, however powerful in the study, dissolves in the face of ordinary life. We cannot help but believe in causation, in the external world, in the continuity of the self, even if we cannot rationally justify these beliefs. Nature is too strong for reason. Custom and habit guide us where argument fails. And this is not a defect but a feature of human psychology, an acknowledgement that we are creatures of sentiment and instinct as much as of reason. Think about what this means for how we approach big questions. Hume suggests we should be modest in our claims, skeptical of grand metaphysical systems, attentive to how we actually think, rather than how philosophers say we ought to think. He invites us to examine the mechanisms of belief, the psychology of conviction, the natural foundations of morality and religion. He offers not a system of certain truths, but a method of inquiry that respects the limits of human understanding, while exploring the rich complexity of human nature. In the darkness of this quiet hour, as we begin our walk through Hume's philosophy, we encounter a thinker who combines radical skepticism with profound psychological insight, who demolishes false certainties while acknowledging the natural beliefs that sustain us, who questions everything while maintaining a gentle humor about the human condition. He woke others from dogmatic slumber, not by offering new certainties, but by showing how little we can be certain of and how much we believe anyway. The questions he raised about knowledge, causation, the self, and morality continue to echo through philosophy. And as we explore them tonight, we might find that uncertainty, properly understood, is not a cause for anxiety, but an invitation to intellectual humility and careful thought. The problem of induction. There is a pattern we all rely on, so fundamental to our thinking that we rarely notice we are using it. The sun has risen every morning of your life, and from this you conclude it will rise tomorrow. Bread has nourished you in the past, and from this you expect it will nourish you in the future. Fire has burned every time you have touched it, and from this you infer it will burn the next time as well. This seems like simple common sense, the most basic form of reasoning. Yet Hume asks a question that reveals a troubling gap in the foundation of this reasoning. What justifies your assumption that the future will resemble the past? This is the problem of induction, and it strikes at the heart of scientific reasoning itself. All our knowledge of matters of fact beyond immediate perception depends on inferring from observed cases to unobserved ones. We see the sun rise 1,000 times and conclude it will rise on the 1,001st morning. We observe that all emeralds we have encountered are green and conclude that emeralds generally are green. Science itself proceeds by this method, moving from particular observations to general laws, from past regularities to predictions about the future. But what licenses this inference? Hume points out that the move from observed to unobserved cases cannot be justified by logic alone. There is no logical contradiction in supposing that the future might be radically different from the past. The sun might fail to rise tomorrow. Bread might poison us next time we eat it. Fire might freeze rather than burn. These suppositions do not involve any logical impossibility in the way that claiming a circle is square would. The future's resemblance to the past is not a truth of logic but an assumption we make. Perhaps, then, experience justifies induction. We observe that inductive reasoning has worked in the past, that predictions based on past regularities have proven reliable. But Hume reveals that this attempted justification is circular. To use past success of induction to justify future uses of induction is itself an inductive argument. We are assuming that because induction worked before, it will work again, which is precisely what we are trying to justify. We cannot use induction to prove induction without begging the question. Think about what this means for our confidence in scientific knowledge. Every scientific law, every causal claim, every prediction about the future rests on inductive inference. When physicists claim that gravity will continue to operate tomorrow as it did today, they are making an inductive inference from past observations. When doctors predict that a medication will have certain effects based on past trials, they are reasoning inductively. Yet, if induction cannot be rationally justified, what becomes of this confidence? Hume does not conclude that we should abandon inductive reasoning. He recognizes that we cannot abandon it even if we wanted to. Nature compels us to reason inductively. After repeated observations of constant conjunction between events, the mind forms a habit of expectation. When we see fire, we automatically expect heat, not because reason has proven the connection, but because custom has established an association in our minds. Induction is not a product of reason but of habit, of the psychological mechanisms that govern belief formation. This is a profound shift in how we understand human reasoning. Reason, for Hume, is far more limited than traditional philosophy assumed. It can discover logical relations between ideas, can perform calculations and deductions, but it cannot establish matters of fact about the unobserved world. That task is accomplished not by reason but by custom, by the associative mechanisms of imagination that create expectations based on past experience. We believe in causation and induction not because we have proven them, but because we cannot help believing them. The problem of induction reveals that our most basic assumptions about the world rest on foundations we cannot rationally secure. This might seem like a devastating skeptical result, yet Hume treats it with remarkable equanimity. He suggests that philosophical skepticism about induction, however irrefutable in theory, cannot survive contact with ordinary life. The moment we leave the study and engage with the world, we find ourselves reasoning inductively despite our inability to justify it. Nature is simply too strong for skeptical arguments. What remains after we recognize this limitation is a kind of naturalized epistemology. We come to see beliefs not as things we choose based on rational evaluation, but as natural products of how our minds work. We believe the future will resemble the past because evolution or nature has wired us to form habits based on repeated experience. This belief serves us well in practice, even though we cannot prove it in theory. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we can live with beliefs that are psychologically inevitable, even if philosophically unjustifiable. The problem of induction invites us to be modest about what we claim to know with certainty, while acknowledging the practical necessity of the beliefs that guide our lives. And in this tension between skeptical doubt and natural belief, we find one of the central themes that will echo through all of Hume's philosophy. Custom and habit as the guide of life. There is a surprising hero in Hume's philosophy, a force more powerful than reason, more reliable than argument, more fundamental to human life than logic. It is not some elevated faculty of pure intellect or mystical intuition. It is something far more ordinary and far more profound, custom and habit. Where philosophers had placed reason on a throne, Hume suggests that the true guide of human life is the humble mechanism of repeated association, the mind's tendency to form expectations based on past experience. Consider how you move through your day. You do not reason your way through most actions. You do not consciously deliberate about whether the floor will support your weight before taking a step, whether food will nourish before eating, whether words will communicate meaning before speaking. These beliefs operate automatically beneath the level of conscious reflection, guiding your actions through patterns established by repeated experience. This is custom at work, the accumulation of associations that makes life possible without constant conscious reasoning. Hume elevates custom from a mere quirk of psychology to the foundation of all our reasoning about matters of fact. When we infer effects from causes, when we predict future events based on past patterns, when we navigate the world with confidence despite lacking logical proof of its regularities, we are guided by custom. The mind naturally associates ideas that have been repeatedly conjoined in experience. After seeing flame followed by heat many times, the appearance of flame automatically triggers the expectation of heat, without any conscious inference or logical deduction. This might seem to diminish human reasoning, to reduce our intellectual life to mere animal conditioning. But Hume sees it differently. He recognizes that custom is precisely what allows us to function effectively in the world. If we required logical proof before believing anything about unobserved matters of fact, we would be paralyzed. We would never eat unfamiliar food, never trust testimony, never plan for the future. Custom provides the practical certainty that reason cannot deliver, the confidence to act despite the absence of absolute proof. Think about learning a new skill. At first, every movement requires conscious attention and deliberate effort, but with practice, the actions become automatic, flowing smoothly without conscious direction. The pianist's fingers find the right keys without thought. The athlete's body executes complex movements without deliberation. This is custom transforming conscious reasoning into automatic habit, creating fluency through repetition. And Hume suggests that much of our mental life operates on this same principle, building up associations that guide belief and action without requiring constant rational evaluation. The power of custom explains why philosophical skepticism, however compelling in the abstract, fails to disturb our natural beliefs. You might read arguments proving that induction cannot be rationally justified, that we have no logical grounds for believing the future will resemble the past. These arguments might seem irrefutable while you consider them in the study. But the moment you step outside and navigate the world, you find yourself reasoning inductively anyway, expecting the stairs to support your weight, the air to continue being breathable, other people to respond intelligibly to your words. Custom reasserts itself despite skeptical arguments because it operates at a level deeper than conscious reasoning. This does not mean custom is infallible. We can form mistaken associations, develop false beliefs through repeated exposure to misleading patterns. The gambler who believes that a streak of losses makes a win more likely has formed an association that does not reflect reality. The person raised in isolation might develop customs that would seem bizarre to others. Custom is a psychological mechanism, not a guarantee of truth. But it is a mechanism that generally serves us well, one that evolution or nature has equipped us with for navigating a world where perfect knowledge is impossible. Hume's emphasis on custom represents a fundamental shift in how we understand human nature. We are not primarily rational beings who occasionally rely on habit. We are primarily creatures of custom who sometimes engage in conscious reasoning. Reason's role is more limited than philosophers had imagined. It can compare ideas, perform calculations, trace out logical implications. But it cannot generate new beliefs about matters of fact. That is the work of experience operating through the mechanism of custom, building up the associations that constitute our practical understanding of the world. What remains is a more modest but more realistic picture of human cognition. We navigate life not through rational calculation, but through accumulated patterns of expectation, through habits that form below the level of consciousness, through customs that guide us more reliably than argument ever could. And in recognizing this, we might develop both humility about reason's power and appreciation for the psychological mechanisms that actually sustain our engagement with reality. The missing shade of blue. There is a curious thought experiment that appears almost casually in Hume's work, a small exception to his grand principle that seems insignificant at first glance. Yet this tiny crack in his system has troubled philosophers for centuries, a puzzle piece that does not quite fit, a counterexample that Hume himself acknowledges but then dismisses as too trivial to undermine his theory. It concerns a single missing shade of blue, and it raises questions about whether the mind can create ideas that do not derive from experience. Hume's empiricism rests on a simple but radical principle. All our ideas are copies of impressions. Every concept in our mind, every thought we can form, traces back to something we have actually experienced through the senses. You have the idea of red because you have seen red things. You have the idea of sweetness because you have tasted sweet things. You can imagine a golden mountain because you have seen gold and mountains separately, and your imagination combines these experienced elements into a new configuration. But you cannot form an idea of anything you have never in some way experienced. This principle seems to account for the vast majority of our mental contents. Abstract ideas derive from concrete impressions. Complex ideas are built from simple ones. Even the most fantastical imaginings, unicorns, dragons, gods, can be analyzed into components that trace back to experience. The mind is creative, but its creativity consists in rearranging materials provided by the senses, not in generating entirely new content from nothing. But then comes the missing shade of blue. Imagine a person who has seen every shade of blue except one. They have experienced deep navy and pale sky blue, rich sapphire and delicate periwinkle, every gradation of blue from nearly black to nearly white, except for a single shade somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Now present them with a series of blue samples arranged from darkest to lightest, with a gap where the missing shade would fall. Could they, having never seen this particular shade, form an idea of what color would fill that gap? Hume admits they probably could. Even without direct impression of this specific shade, the mind could extrapolate from the surrounding shades and construct an idea of the missing color. The person could imagine what shade would smoothly bridge the transition from the blue just darker than the gap to the blue just lighter. And if they could do this, then here is a case where an idea exists without a corresponding impression, a counterexample to Hume's fundamental principle that all ideas are copies of impressions. What makes this thought experiment fascinating is Hume's reaction to it. He does not revise his principle or construct elaborate defenses. He simply acknowledges the counterexample as so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing, and proceeds as if his principle remains intact. This might seem like philosophical negligence, an unwillingness to deal with a problem that undermines his entire system. But perhaps Hume recognizes something important, that principles in empirical philosophy, like principles in natural science, admit of rare exceptions without collapsing entirely. Think about what the missing shade reveals. It suggests that the mind has a capacity for interpolation, for filling in gaps based on patterns in surrounding data. This is not creation from nothing, but a kind of sophisticated inference, using the structure evident in experienced shades to project what an unexperienced shade must be like. The mind is not inventing an entirely novel color outside any experiential framework. It is using extensive experience with blues to generate a highly constrained prediction about a specific shade it has not encountered. This capacity might be more significant than Hume acknowledges. It suggests that the mind can perform operations on experienced contents to generate ideas that go slightly beyond direct impression. We can imagine intermediate states between things we have experienced. We can extrapolate trends and project continuations of patterns. We can fill in missing elements when the surrounding context provides sufficient constraint. The mind is not purely passive, merely receiving and recombining impressions. It has some active capacity to structure and extend experience. Yet the missing shade of blue does not vindicate rationalism. The person could not imagine blue at all without extensive experience of colors. They could not conjure this particular shade without experience of many other blues, establishing the spectrum within which interpolation becomes possible. The mind's creative capacity remains tethered to experience, constrained by what has been encountered through the senses. It is a small exception that proves the rule rather than overturning it. Perhaps what this thought experiment ultimately reveals is that the line between experience and imagination is not absolutely sharp. There is a continuum between directly perceiving something and creatively constructing it from experiential elements. The missing shade of blue occupies a peculiar middle ground, not directly experienced, yet so close to experience, so tightly constrained by it, that the mind can bridge the tiny gap, and in acknowledging this, Hume shows a flexibility in his empiricism, a willingness to note complications even while maintaining his fundamental insight that experience is the source of mental content. The missing shade remains, a small but persistent puzzle in Hume's philosophy, reminding us that even the most elegant principles face edge cases that do not quite fit. Impressions and ideas. There is a distinction that seems simple at first, but reveals profound implications when examined carefully. Hume divides all the contents of the mind into two categories: impressions and ideas. Impressions are the vivid, forceful experiences that strike us as we perceive the world. The redness of a rose when you look at it, the pain when you stub your toe, the melody when you hear music playing. Ideas are the fainter copies of these impressions that remain in the mind when the original experience has passed, remembering the rose, recalling the pain, thinking about the melody. The difference is one of force and vivacity. Impressions hit us with immediate intensity. They are present, compelling, impossible to ignore while we are having them. You cannot doubt that you are experiencing pain when your hand touches a hot stove. The sensation forces itself upon your consciousness with undeniable reality. But when you later remember that pain, the idea is paler, less forceful, a representation rather than the thing itself. The memory of pain is not painful in the same way the original sensation was. This distinction becomes the foundation of Hume's theory of mind. He insists that every idea must ultimately trace back to an impression. You cannot have the idea of red without having seen red things. You cannot conceive of sweetness without having tasted sweet things. The mind is not a source of original content, but a processor of sensory data, forming ideas by copying impressions and then combining, dividing, and rearranging these copies in various ways. Think about how this maps onto your own experience. When you imagine a friend's face, you are working with ideas derived from impressions of seeing them. When you plan tomorrow's activities, you are combining ideas copied from past impressions of places, actions, and objects. Even abstract concepts like justice or causation can be traced back, through analysis, to impressions perhaps of experiencing fairness or unfairness, of observing one event following another repeatedly. The mind's creativity consists not in generating genuinely new content, but in recombining elements that ultimately derive from experience. But impressions themselves divide into two types: impressions of sensation and impressions of reflection. Impressions of sensation come through the external senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. These are our primary contact with the external world, the raw data that perception provides. From these arise ideas, and these ideas then give rise to impressions of reflection, emotions, desires, passions that arise in response to our ideas. You see a friend, impression of sensation, remember past pleasant times together, ideas, and feel affection, impression of reflection. This creates a cycle. Sensations produce ideas, ideas produce passions, and these passions can themselves be remembered as ideas, which might produce further passions. The mind is constantly active, processing impressions into ideas, generating new impressions of reflection in response to ideas, building up an increasingly complex web of mental contents, all ultimately grounded in original sensory impressions. The criterion of force and vivacity, while generally reliable, admits of some complexities. In fever or madness, ideas might become as vivid as impressions. In dreams, we mistake ideas for impressions, experiencing imagined events as if they were present realities. And sometimes impressions can be faint, while ideas are particularly strong. A distant sound might be barely noticed, while a vivid memory commands attention. So the distinction is not absolute, but admits of degrees and context-dependent judgments. Yet Hume's principle remains powerful. Ideas are derived from impressions. This gives him a method for testing philosophical claims. When someone uses a term like substance or necessary connection, Hume asks, from what impression is this idea derived? If no impression can be identified, if the term cannot be traced back to actual experience, then perhaps it is meaningless, a word that seems to refer but actually points to nothing in our experience. This becomes Hume's tool for deflating metaphysical pretensions, for showing that many philosophical concepts are empty precisely because they do not copy any impression. Consider the implications for knowledge. If all our ideas derive from impressions, then our knowledge is limited to what experience can provide. We cannot know about things we have never experienced, or cannot experience in principle. We cannot have ideas that transcend possible experience. The mind is bounded by the senses, unable to generate content that does not ultimately trace back to what we have actually perceived or felt. This might seem limiting, a reduction of mental life to mere passivity before sensory input, but Hume sees it as liberating. It frees us from fruitless speculation about things we cannot experience. It grounds philosophy in psychological reality rather than abstract theorizing. It gives us a clear criterion for distinguishing meaningful concepts from empty verbiage, and it shows that the mind, even while bounded by experience, possesses remarkable powers to combine and recombine experiential elements into rich and complex ideas. The distinction between impressions and ideas, simple as it seems, becomes the lens through which Hume examines all of mental life, the principle that guides his investigations into causation, the self, morality, and belief. The bundle theory of the self. There is a question that seems to have an obvious answer. If someone asks you whether you exist, whether there is a self that persists through time, whether you are the same person who woke up this morning or who existed 5 years ago, the answer seems self-evident. Of course you exist. Of course there is a continuous self that endures through changing experiences. Yet when Hume looks for this self in his actual experience, when he searches for the impression that would give rise to the idea of a persisting self, he finds something surprising. Nothing at all. Hume's method requires that every meaningful idea correspond to an impression. So when we speak of the self, we should be able to point to some impression from which this idea derives. We should be able to identify the experience of the self as a distinct, perceivable entity. But when Hume examines his own consciousness, he finds only particular perceptions, a thought here, a sensation there, an emotion arising and passing away. He never catches himself existing as something separate from these particular perceptions, never encounters the self as a distinct impression underlying or unifying all the specific experiences. Try this experiment yourself. Close your eyes and look for yourself. What do you actually find? Perhaps you notice thoughts flowing through your mind. Perhaps you become aware of sensations in your body, sounds in your environment, emotions rising and falling. But do you perceive the self as something distinct from these experiences, something that has them rather than being them? Hume suggests that when we search honestly, we find only the stream of particular perceptions, not the supposed substance to which they belong. This leads to Hume's remarkable conclusion. The self is nothing but a bundle of perceptions. There is no underlying substance, no essential core that persists through all our changing experiences. What we call the self is simply a collection of perceptions succeeding each other with incredible rapidity, in constant flux and movement. The self is like a theater where various perceptions make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. And crucially, there is no underlying stage on which this performance occurs, no unchanging substrate beneath the changing perceptions. Think about what this implies for personal identity. If the self is just a bundle of perceptions, then what makes you the same person over time? The perceptions you have now are completely different from those you had as a child. The thoughts, sensations, memories, and emotions that constitute your current experience bear little resemblance to those that constituted your experience years ago. Yet we assume there is continuity, that the same self persists through these radical changes in experiential content. Hume suggests that what we mistake for substantial identity is actually a psychological phenomenon produced by memory and causation. Memory creates the impression of continuity by linking present perceptions to past ones. You remember experiences from your past and attribute them to yourself, and this creates the feeling of being the same person who had those experiences. Causation connects your current perceptions to past ones in chains of influence. Past experiences shape present dispositions. Earlier decisions constrain later options. Previous learning enables current abilities. These relations of memory and causation make the bundle of perceptions seem like a unified self, even though no such unified substance exists. This is a profoundly unsettling conclusion. It suggests that the self we take for granted, the I that seems so obviously real and persistent, is actually a fiction, a convenient way of organizing experience, but not a metaphysical reality. You are not a thing that has experiences, but rather the experiences themselves, bundled together by psychological relations, but lacking any underlying unity or substance. Yet Hume acknowledges a problem with this view. If the self is just a bundle of perceptions, what bundles them together? What makes this collection of perceptions my perceptions rather than a random assortment? There must be some principle of unity, some way of distinguishing one bundle from another, one person from another. Hume admits he cannot solve this problem satisfactorily. In later reflections, he confesses that his account of personal identity leads to contradictions he cannot resolve, that he finds himself lost in a labyrinth from which he cannot find his way out. But perhaps the difficulty itself is instructive. It suggests that the self is not the sort of thing that admits of neat philosophical analysis. The self is not a simple, perceivable entity like a sensation of red or the taste of salt. It is something more complex, more elusive, something that emerges from the relations among perceptions rather than existing as a discrete impression. And maybe our ordinary belief in a persisting self is not a carefully reasoned conclusion, but a natural belief, another example of custom and habit guiding us where reason cannot provide certainty. The bundle theory strips the self of metaphysical grandeur. You are not an immortal soul, not a substantial essence, not a unified consciousness underlying all experience. You are a constantly changing collection of perceptions held together by psychological relations, creating the illusion of unity through memory and causal connection. And in this radical deflation of the self, Hume anticipates themes that will resonate through later philosophy and psychology, questioning the very notion of a stable, enduring identity beneath the flux of experience. Causation as a fiction of the mind. There is a relationship, we assume, governs the entire universe, a connection so fundamental that science itself depends upon it. When one billiard ball strikes another, the second ball moves. We say the first ball caused the second to move. When you drop a glass, it falls and shatters. We say gravity caused it to fall. The impact caused it to shatter. Causation seems to be the cement of the universe, the necessary connection that binds events together in regular patterns. Yet Hume looks at causation and asks, what do we actually observe when we perceive this supposed necessary connection? Consider the billiard balls carefully. What do you actually see? You see one ball moving across the table. You see it make contact with another ball. You see the second ball begin to move. These are observable events: motion, contact, motion. But where in this sequence do you observe the causation itself, the power of the first ball to make the second move, the necessary connection that forces the second ball into motion? Hume's disturbing answer: nowhere. We observe the sequence of events, but we never observe the causal power or necessary connection itself. This seems absurd at first. Surely the first ball makes the second ball move. Surely there is more to causation than mere sequence. But Hume asks us to distinguish carefully between what we observe and what we infer. We observe constant conjunction whenever events of type A occur, they are followed by events of type B. We observe that ball strikes are always followed by ball movements, that flame touchings are always followed by pain feelings, that bread eatings are always followed by nourishment. But constant conjunction is not the same as necessary connection. The regular sequence of events does not reveal a power in the first that compels the second. Think about what this means for our concept of causation. We take causation to involve necessity, that given the cause, the effect must follow, that the cause produces or brings about the effect through some power or force. But Hume points out that necessity is not something we observe in the world. We see one thing happening and then another thing happening, repeatedly, but we never see the must that supposedly connects them. The necessity we attribute to causation is not derived from any impression of necessary connection in the objects themselves. So where does our idea of causation come from, if not from observing necessary connection? Hume's answer is psychological rather than metaphysical. After repeated observation of constant conjunction, the mind forms a habit. When we see cause-type events, we automatically expect effect-type events to follow. This expectation is not a conclusion of reasoning, but a product of custom. The mind has been conditioned by repeated experience to associate certain types of events, to feel a determination or compulsion to think of the effect when perceiving the cause. It is this internal impression, this feeling of determination in the mind, that gives rise to our idea of necessary connection. The necessity is not in the objects, but in the psychological compulsion we feel to expect the effect after seeing the cause. Causation is a projection of our mental habits onto the world. We observe regular sequences, form expectations through custom, and then mistakenly suppose that the necessity we feel in our thoughts corresponds to a necessary connection in reality. This is a revolutionary analysis. Hume is claiming that one of our most fundamental concepts, perhaps the most fundamental concept in science, is not derived from observation of the world, but from reflection on our own mental operations. Causation is a fiction in the sense that the necessity it purports to describe does not exist in nature, but only in our habits of expectation. The universe consists of events occurring in regular patterns, and it is our minds that supply the sense of necessity, the feeling that these patterns must continue. Consider the implications for scientific laws. When Newton formulated the law of universal gravitation, he described regular patterns in how objects move. But Hume would say that the necessity we attribute to this law, the sense that objects must move according to it, is not discovered in nature, but supplied by our minds. We observe that objects always have moved in certain patterns and form the habit of expecting them to continue moving in these patterns. But we have no rational guarantee that the future will resemble the past, no observation of necessity that proves the pattern must continue. This might seem to undermine science entirely. If causation is a fiction, if we have no grounds for assuming that observed patterns will continue, what becomes of scientific prediction and explanation? But Hume does not counsel abandoning science. He recognizes that custom is a perfectly reliable guide in practice, that our habits of expectation serve us well, even if they cannot be rationally justified. Science can proceed by observing regularities and forming expectations based on past patterns, even while acknowledging that these expectations rest on psychological habits rather than logical proof or observation of necessary connections. What Hume's analysis of causation reveals is a fundamental gap between our concepts and reality. We think we are describing necessary connections in nature, but we are actually describing psychological habits projected onto nature. The world offers us regular sequences, our minds supply the sense of necessity, and in recognizing this, we gain both humility about what we can know with certainty and clarity about the psychological foundations of our most basic beliefs. The is-ought problem. There is a gap that appears in moral reasoning, a logical leap that seems innocent but conceals a profound difficulty. Philosophers begin by describing how things are. Human nature is such and such. Society functions in this way. Historical patterns reveal these facts. Then, almost imperceptibly, they transition to prescriptions about how things ought to be. Therefore, we should act like this. Therefore, certain moral rules are binding. Therefore, this conduct is virtuous, and that conduct vicious. But Hume stops at this transition and asks, how do we get from descriptions of what is to prescriptions of what ought to be? This is the is-ought problem, and it reveals a gulf between facts and values that cannot be bridged by logic alone. Statements about what is the case are categorically different from statements about what ought to be the case. The fact that human beings naturally feel sympathy does not by itself entail that we ought to cultivate sympathy or act sympathetically. The fact that certain actions produce happiness does not, without additional premises, prove that we ought to pursue happiness. No amount of factual description logically entails a moral prescription. Think about how pervasive this problem is in moral reasoning. Someone argues that because human beings evolved to prefer their genetic relatives, we ought to prioritize family. But why should evolutionary history dictate moral obligation? Someone claims that because most people in a society believe certain acts are wrong, those acts are morally wrong. But why should majority opinion determine moral truth? Someone insists that because God commands certain actions, we ought to perform them. But why should divine commands create moral obligations? Hume is not claiming that we cannot move from is to ought. He is pointing out that the move requires something beyond mere description of facts. We need a connecting principle, an additional premise that establishes the relevance of facts for values. We need to explain why certain facts about human nature, social consequences, divine will, or anything else should matter morally. And this connecting principle itself cannot be derived from pure description without entering a regress. We would need another principle to connect the first principle to facts and so on. The traditional way philosophers attempted to bridge the is-ought gap was through theories of natural law or divine command. They argued that certain moral truths are built into the nature of things or decreed by God, and therefore facts about nature or divine will directly entail moral obligations. But Hume's empiricism undermines these strategies. If all our ideas derive from impressions, if we cannot observe moral properties in nature the way we observe colors or shapes, then moral claims cannot be straightforwardly factual. We do not perceive wrongness the way we perceive redness. Consider what happens when you examine an act you consider morally wrong, perhaps cruelty to an innocent person. You observe the physical actions, the suffering produced, the intentions of the agent, the circumstances of the act. But where do you observe the wrongness itself? Hume suggests that you find the wrongness not in the external facts, but in your own response, in the sentiment of disapproval or moral disgust that arises when you contemplate these facts. Morality is not in the facts themselves, but in how we feel about the facts. This leads Hume toward a sentimentalist view of morality. Moral judgments are not descriptions of moral facts, but expressions of moral sentiments. When we say an action is wrong, we are not stating a fact about the action, but expressing our disapproval of it. When we say someone is virtuous, we are not describing an objective property they possess, but articulating our approval of their character. Morality is rooted in feeling rather than reason, in sentiment rather than fact. But this does not make morality arbitrary or purely subjective. Hume believes that human beings share a common nature that produces similar moral sentiments across individuals and cultures. We generally approve of benevolence, honesty, justice, and kindness because these qualities are naturally agreeable to human sentiment. We generally disapprove of cruelty, dishonesty, injustice, and callousness because these qualities produce painful sentiments. Morality is grounded in human nature, specifically in the sentiments that arise from our shared humanity. The is-ought problem remains a fundamental challenge for moral philosophy. It reveals that morality cannot be reduced to science, that no amount of empirical investigation can settle moral questions conclusively, that values do not straightforwardly follow from facts. But it also clarifies where morality does come from, not from reason discovering moral truths in nature, but from sentiment responding to facts in characteristically human ways. And in this clarification, Hume shifts moral philosophy from a search for objective moral facts to an investigation of moral psychology, of how human nature produces the sentiments that constitute our moral experience. Miracles and the weight of testimony. There is a question that touches the foundations of religious belief, a question about extraordinary claims and the evidence required to support them. When someone reports a miracle, a violation of natural law, an event that contradicts our uniform experience of how the world works, should we believe them? Hume's answer is careful, precise, and devastating to most miracle claims. We should believe testimony for a miracle only when the falsehood of that testimony would be more miraculous than the event it reports. Consider what makes an event a miracle. It is not merely unusual or rare. It is a violation of natural law, a break in the regular patterns that govern reality. Water does not spontaneously turn into wine. The dead do not rise. The sun does not stand still in the sky. We have overwhelming experience that nature operates according to regular laws, that the patterns we have observed continue without exception. A miracle is precisely a claim that these patterns have been violated, that what always happens failed to happen, or what never happens did happen. Now consider the nature of testimony. When someone tells you they witnessed an event, you must weigh the reliability of their report against the improbability of what they claim to have seen. People make mistakes. Memory is fallible. Perception can deceive. People exaggerate, embellish, sometimes deliberately lie. The more extraordinary the claim, the stronger the evidence needs to be to overcome these natural sources of error and deception. Hume formulates this as a maxim: a wise person proportions their belief to the evidence. If you have uniform experience that a certain type of event always occurs, that dropped objects fall, that fire burns, that dead people remain dead, then testimony claiming an exception to these uniform patterns fights against the entire weight of your experience. The testimony must be so reliable, so well attested, so immune to reasonable doubt that believing it false would itself be miraculous. Think about what this means in practice. Suppose someone tells you they saw a man walk on water. On one side of the scale, you have the testimony of this witness, perhaps honest, perhaps mistaken, perhaps deceived, perhaps lying. On the other side, you have your entire lifetime of experience, that solid objects denser than water sink, that human bodies are denser than water, that walking on water violates physical laws that have never been observed to fail. Which is more probable, that natural law was violated, or that the testimony is unreliable in some way? Hume acknowledges that testimony can be very strong. If multiple independent witnesses of known reliability all report the same event, if they have nothing to gain from deception, if their testimony is consistent and detailed, the evidence becomes more persuasive. But even the best testimony must overcome the immense weight of uniform experience against miracles. And historically, Hume suggests, miracle claims are typically supported by exactly the kind of testimony we should be most skeptical of: reports from credulous people, from those with religious motivations, from distant times and places where verification is impossible, often embellished through multiple retellings. Consider the psychological factors that make miracle reports unreliable. People love the marvelous. We are naturally drawn to extraordinary stories, inclined to believe claims that excite wonder. Religious devotion can motivate both honest self-deception and deliberate fraud. The desire to support one's faith, to provide evidence for beliefs already held, can unconsciously shape perception and memory. And once a miracle story circulates, it tends to grow in the telling, becoming more dramatic and less plausible with each retelling. Hume also notes that miracle claims tend to be abundant in ignorant ages and nations, but become rarer as education and science advance. This pattern suggests that miracles are not actually violations of natural law, but misunderstandings or exaggerations of natural phenomena, products of limited knowledge about how the world works. As we better understand nature, the space for miracle claims shrinks, not because miracles have stopped occurring, but because we have better explanations for events that previously seemed miraculous. What about miracles that supposedly establish the truth of a religion? Hume points out a peculiar problem. Different religions claim miracles supporting incompatible doctrines. Christians claim miracles proving Christian truth. Muslims claim miracles proving Islamic truth. If we accept miracle testimony as evidence for religious doctrine, we find ourselves with evidence supporting contradictory conclusions. The miracles cancel each other out, each religion's miracle claims undermining the others. This does not mean Hume proves miracles are impossible. He acknowledges that we can imagine evidence strong enough to make belief in a miracle reasonable. Perhaps if you directly witnessed an event violating natural law, if multiple senses confirmed it, if it occurred repeatedly under controlled conditions. But he insists that historical testimony never reaches this standard, that reports of miracles from the past, no matter how venerable the tradition reporting them, cannot outweigh our uniform experience of natural regularity. The argument reveals Hume's empiricism at work. We have extensive experience of testimony being unreliable, and no experience of natural laws being violated. Therefore, the hypothesis that testimony errs is always more probable than the hypothesis that nature departed from its uniform patterns. And this conclusion, however troubling for religious belief, follows from applying the same standards of evidence we use in every other domain of inquiry. The argument from design dismantled. There is an argument for God's existence that seems to derive from simple observation of the world around us. Look at the intricate structure of the eye, perfectly adapted for vision. Consider the delicate balance of planetary orbits that allows life to flourish. Observe the complex interdependence of ecosystems, the precise physical constants that make the universe possible. Such order and apparent purpose, the argument goes, cannot be the product of chance. Just as a watch implies a watchmaker, the designed world implies a divine designer. This is the argument from design, and Hume subjects it to devastating critique. The argument proceeds by analogy. We observe that human artifacts showing order and purpose are products of intelligent design. A house implies an architect. A painting implies a painter. A machine implies an engineer. The universe resembles these artifacts in exhibiting order and apparent purpose. Therefore, by analogy, the universe implies a designer, God. The argument seems straightforward, almost commonsensical, yet Hume reveals multiple weaknesses that undermine its force. First, consider the strength of the analogy itself. Analogical arguments are only as strong as the similarity between the things being compared. Houses, paintings, and machines are small, observable products of human intelligence, created through processes we can witness and understand. The universe is vast, unique, encompassing everything that exists, produced through processes we cannot observe. The dissimilarities between a human artifact and the entire cosmos are at least as striking as the similarities. Why should we expect what holds for watches to hold for universes? Moreover, we know from experience that human artifacts are designed because we have repeatedly observed humans designing them. We have seen architects draw plans and builders construct houses. We have watched painters create paintings. This experiential foundation allows us to infer design from order in these familiar cases. But we have never observed universe creation. We have no experience of gods or cosmic designers at work. The analogy asks us to extrapolate from very small-scale, well-understood cases to a case utterly unlike anything in our experience. Think about the limitations this reveals. Even if the argument worked, what would it prove? It might establish that the universe had some kind of designer, but it tells us nothing about the designer's properties. The designer might be finite rather than infinite, imperfect rather than perfect, material rather than spiritual. Perhaps the universe was designed by a committee of gods, or by a junior deity practicing their craft, or by a long-dead designer who no longer exists. The argument from design, even if successful, cannot establish the God of traditional theism, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good and eternal. Hume also raises the possibility of alternative explanations for apparent design. Perhaps the universe exhibits order not because of conscious design, but because of natural principles operating over vast stretches of time. Perhaps random motion eventually produces stable configurations that persist simply because unstable configurations collapse. Perhaps what appears as design is actually the result of natural selection. Configurations that function well survive, while those that don't disappear. In raising these alternatives, Hume anticipates evolutionary explanations that would emerge a century after his death. Consider also the problem of evil. If we infer God's properties from the universe he supposedly designed, what do the universe's characteristics tell us? We see not only order but chaos, not only beauty but ugliness, not only pleasure but suffering. The world contains earthquakes, diseases, predation, death. If we are inferring the designer's nature from the design, shouldn't we conclude that the designer is indifferent to suffering, or perhaps even malevolent? The argument from design proves too much. It would establish a deeply flawed designer based on the deeply flawed world we observe. Hume presents these objections through the voice of a skeptical character in his dialogues concerning natural religion. One speaker, Philo, systematically dismantles the design argument, while other characters attempt to defend it. The dialogue format allows Hume to explore objections and responses from multiple angles, showing the complexity of the issue while ultimately leaving the design argument in ruins. The work was so controversial that Hume withheld it from publication during his lifetime, knowing it would provoke intense criticism. The fundamental problem with the design argument is that it tries to prove too much from too little. It takes our limited experience of human artifact creation and attempts to extrapolate to conclusions about the origin of the universe. It assumes that order requires conscious design when we have no experience of universe creation to support this assumption. It ignores alternative explanations and overlooks features of the universe that contradict the hypothesis of benevolent design. What remains after Hume's critique is not atheism, but epistemic humility. We simply do not have sufficient evidence to conclude that the universe was designed by an intelligent creator. The appearance of order might result from design, or from natural principles, or from chance operating over vast time, or from causes we cannot imagine. We lack the experiential basis to decide between these alternatives with confidence. The universe's origin and structure remain mysterious, and no argument from analogy can penetrate this mystery. This does not make religious belief irrational, but it does mean that such belief cannot be grounded in philosophical arguments from design. If religious conviction is to be defended, it must find foundations elsewhere in faith, in religious experience, in revelation, not in logical inference from the observable characteristics of the natural world. And this separation of faith from natural theology represents a significant shift in how we think about the relationship between religion and reason. The watchmaker argument, once considered compelling evidence for God, dissolves under Hume's skeptical examination, leaving only questions where certainty once seemed assured. Moral sentiment over moral reason. There is a dispute that divides moral philosophers into opposing camps. Some insist that morality is discovered by reason, that moral truths are like mathematical truths, accessible to rational reflection and binding independent of our feelings. Others argue that morality is rooted in sentiment, that moral judgments express emotional responses rather than rational conclusions. Hume takes a clear position in this debate. Reason alone can never motivate action or ground moral distinctions. Morality belongs to the realm of feeling, not calculation. Consider how you actually make moral judgments. When you witness an act of cruelty, what happens in your mind? Do you perform a series of logical deductions concluding that cruelty is wrong? Or do you feel an immediate sentiment of disapproval, a visceral response of moral disgust? When you observe kindness, do you reason your way to approval, or do you experience a warm feeling of admiration? Hume suggests that if we examine moral judgment honestly, we find sentiment at its foundation, not reasoning. This is not to say that reason plays no role in morality. Reason can inform us of relevant facts, trace out consequences of actions, correct mistakes about circumstances. If you believe an act is harmful when it is actually beneficial, reason can correct this factual error. If you fail to notice that your action will hurt someone, reason can reveal this consequence. But once all the facts are clear, once reason has done its work of providing information, something else must step in to generate moral judgment, sentiment. Think about Hume's famous example. Suppose you see someone about to murder an innocent person. You can reason about this situation extensively, calculating the victim's preferences, analyzing the social consequences, considering the murderer's motives. But none of this reasoning by itself generates the judgment that murder is wrong. What makes it wrong is that human nature responds to such contemplated actions with sentiments of disapproval, horror, moral indignation. The wrongness is not in the facts themselves, but in how we feel about those facts. This leads to a striking claim. Moral distinctions are not derived from reason, but from sentiment. When we call an action virtuous or vicious, we are not stating a fact discovered through reason, but expressing an emotional response. Virtue is whatever produces agreeable sentiment in those who contemplate it. Vice is whatever produces disagreeable sentiment. Morality is fundamentally about how actions, characters, and qualities make us feel, not about logical relationships or abstract truths. Hume offers an argument for this position. Reason alone cannot motivate action, but morality essentially involves motivation. Reason can only inform us of means to ends, of what follows from what, of logical and causal relations. But reason cannot tell us what ends to pursue. It cannot generate desires or motivations. Only the passions, emotions, sentiments, desires can move us to act. Therefore, morality, which essentially involves motivating action, must be rooted in passion rather than reason. Consider the implications for moral disagreement. If moral judgments were deliverances of reason, like mathematical truths, then moral disagreements would indicate logical error. Someone must be reasoning incorrectly. But if moral judgments express sentiments, disagreements might reflect different emotional constitutions or different cultivated sensibilities. Two people might have access to all the same facts, reason correctly about consequences, and still arrive at different moral conclusions because their sentiments respond differently to the same situations. Yet Hume does not embrace moral relativism. He believes that human nature is sufficiently uniform that people generally share similar moral sentiments. We are built to feel sympathy for others' suffering, to admire benevolence and courage, to disapprove of cruelty and cowardice. These shared sentiments provide a foundation for morality that, while not absolute in the way rationalists hoped, is stable enough to ground moral discourse and social cooperation. Think about why certain qualities are universally praised across cultures. Honesty, kindness, courage, justice, these virtues produce agreeable sentiments in nearly all human observers. They are useful, either to their possessor or to society at large, and utility naturally produces sentiments of approval. Conversely, cruelty, treachery, cowardice, and injustice produce disagreeable sentiments because they are harmful. Morality tracks what produces these characteristic human responses, not what follows from logical axioms. The role of sympathy becomes central to Hume's moral psychology. Sympathy is the capacity to share in others' emotions, to feel pleasure at their happiness and pain at their suffering. When we observe someone being helped, we sympathetically experience their gratitude and pleasure, which produces in us approval of the helper. When we witness cruelty, we sympathetically feel the victim's pain, which produces disapproval of the cruel person. Morality is built on this capacity for emotional resonance with others. This sympathy extends even to strangers and to people distant from us in time and space. We can feel moral approval or disapproval of historical figures, of people we will never meet, of actions that do not affect us personally. This is because sympathy, while stronger for those close to us, is not limited to our immediate circle. It is a general capacity to take up the perspectives of others, to imagine their feelings, to respond emotionally to their situations. But Hume recognizes a problem. Sympathy is naturally stronger for those near to us and weaker for strangers and distant people. This would seem to make morality partial and unreliable. He responds by suggesting that we adopt a general point of view in moral judgment, abstracting from our particular position to consider how a quality or action would appear to anyone considering it impartially. This general viewpoint corrects for the distortions of sympathy, allowing us to make more stable and universal moral judgments. Consider what this theory means for moral language. When you say murder is wrong, you are not describing an objective property of murder that exists independent of sentiments. You are expressing your sentiment of disapproval toward murder and inviting others to share this sentiment. Moral language has an expressive and prescriptive function, not merely a descriptive one. It communicates feelings and attempts to evoke similar feelings in others. This does not make morality arbitrary or merely subjective in a problematic sense. The sentiments that ground morality are natural products of human psychology, shaped by our common nature and social experience. They are as objective as any psychological fact can be. Different individuals might have slightly different moral sentiments due to temperament or upbringing, but the core moral sentiments are sufficiently universal to provide a shared foundation for moral life. Hume's sentimentalism has profound implications for how we think about moral education and reform. If morality is rooted in sentiment rather than reason, then moral improvement is less about teaching better arguments and more about cultivating appropriate emotions. We become more moral by developing our capacity for sympathy, by exposing ourselves to diverse perspectives, by training our sentiments to respond appropriately to virtue and vice. Moral education is education of feeling, not merely education of intellect. The contrast with rationalist moral theories could not be starker. Where rationalists like Kant would later argue that morality must be grounded in reason to be truly binding and objective, Hume insists that reason alone is motivationally inert, unable to generate the force that morality requires. Where rationalists seek universal moral laws derived from pure reason, Hume finds moral judgment rooted in the particular sentiments of human nature. Morality for Hume is fundamentally a human phenomenon, built from our emotional responses rather than discovered through logical deduction. What emerges is a naturalistic picture of morality, one that sees moral judgment as a natural function of human psychology, explicable in terms of sentiments shaped by nature and refined by social experience. Morality needs no supernatural foundation, no divine commands, no realm of abstract moral facts. It arises from and is sustained by the sentiments that characterize human nature itself. Sympathy as the foundation of ethics. There is a capacity within human nature that makes moral life possible, a psychological mechanism so fundamental that without it, ethics would be impossible. It is not reason calculating consequences, not will imposing discipline, not divine command instilling fear. It is sympathy, the natural tendency to share in the emotions of others, to feel pleasure at their joy and pain at their suffering. Hume identifies sympathy as the foundation of ethics, the bridge between self-interest and moral concern for others. Sympathy is not merely feeling sorry for someone. It is something deeper and more pervasive, the communication of emotions from one mind to another. When you see a friend's face light up with joy, you feel a corresponding lift in your own spirits. When you witness a stranger in pain, you experience discomfort. When you observe someone embarrassed, you feel a sympathetic awkwardness. These are not conscious inferences, but automatic emotional responses, one person's sentiments triggering similar sentiments in the observer. Think about how this works mechanically in Hume's system. You observe signs of emotion in another person, facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, descriptions of their situation. These observations produce an idea of what the other person is feeling. But through sympathy, this idea becomes enlivened, acquiring force and vivacity until it approaches the force of an impression. The idea of another's emotion is converted into a feeling of that emotion in yourself. You don't just think about their happiness, you feel happy. You don't just conceive of their suffering, you suffer with them. This sympathetic mechanism explains how we can have moral sentiments about actions that don't affect us directly. When you hear about injustice in a distant country, you are not personally harmed, yet you feel moral disapproval. Why? Because sympathy allows you to share in the victim's suffering, to feel their pain as if it were your own. This sympathetic suffering then produces the sentiment of moral disapproval toward the perpetrators. Morality extends beyond self-interest precisely because sympathy extends our emotional concern beyond ourselves. Consider how sympathy operates in moral judgment. When you evaluate someone's character or actions, you don't merely calculate effects on your own interests. You consider the effects on everyone involved, and through sympathy, you emotionally resonate with these effects. An action that produces widespread happiness triggers sympathetic pleasure in you, generating moral approval. An action that causes suffering triggers sympathetic pain, generating moral disapproval. The moral quality of actions is thus determined by the sympathetic sentiments they produce in observers. But sympathy faces a problem. It is naturally partial. We sympathize more strongly with those close to us, family, friends, compatriots, and less strongly with strangers and distant people. Our emotional responses to suffering vary, depending on how connected we feel to the sufferer. If morality were based solely on our natural sympathetic responses, it would be disturbingly provincial and arbitrary, approving of actions that benefit our group while remaining indifferent to harm suffered by outsiders. Hume addresses this through what he calls the general point of view. In making moral judgments, we learn to abstract from our particular position and consider how actions would appear from a more universal perspective. We correct for the distortions of partial sympathy by imaginatively adopting the standpoint of anyone considering the action. This doesn't eliminate the role of sympathy, but it regulates and universalizes it, allowing us to make moral judgments that have stability and consistency across different observers. Think about how this correction works in practice. You might naturally feel little sympathy for someone you've never met in a country you've never visited. But when making a moral judgment about an action affecting that person, you adopt a more impartial perspective. You ask how you would feel about the action if you considered it from a point of view that gave equal weight to everyone's interests. This mental operation corrects for the limitations of natural sympathy while still grounding moral judgment in sentiment rather than reason. Sympathy also explains why certain virtues are universally praised. Qualities like benevolence, generosity, and kindness produce pleasure in their possessor and in those around them. Through sympathy, we share in this pleasure when we contemplate such qualities, which generates our approval and marks these qualities as virtuous. Conversely, cruelty, selfishness, and indifference cause pain. Through sympathy, we share in this pain, generating disapproval and marking these qualities as vicious. The utility of actions and character traits plays a crucial role here. We approve of qualities that are useful or agreeable, either to their possessor or to society at large, and we disapprove of qualities that are harmful. But we don't approve of useful qualities through a cold calculation of utility. We approve of them because sympathy allows us to share in the pleasure that utility produces. Justice is approved because it contributes to social order, and through sympathy we share in the benefits that order provides to everyone. Hume recognizes that sympathy can be strengthened or weakened by various factors. Similarity between observer and observed increases sympathy. We find it easier to sympathize with those who resemble us in culture, beliefs, or circumstances. Proximity also matters. We sympathize more readily with nearby suffering than distant suffering. Familiarity, beauty, and 100 other factors modulate the strength of our sympathetic responses. Yet despite these variations, sympathy provides a sufficiently stable foundation for morality. Human beings are similar enough in nature that their sympathetic responses converge on core moral judgments. We agree that cruelty is wrong, kindness is praiseworthy, justice is valuable, because these judgments reflect sentiments produced by our shared capacity for sympathy operating on common features of human experience. What emerges is a naturalistic ethics built on the psychology of emotion rather than the deliverances of reason or the commands of divinity. Morality is neither invented by society nor discovered through pure reason. It grows naturally from the sympathetic capacity that characterizes human nature, refined and extended through social experience and imaginative correction, producing the moral sentiments that guide our evaluation of character and conduct. The passions that rule reason. There is a claim that has shocked philosophers and troubled rationalists for centuries, a declaration so bold it seems to overturn the traditional hierarchy of human faculties. Hume states it plainly: reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. Reason cannot motivate action by itself. It cannot generate desires or aversions. It cannot tell us what ends to pursue. All of these belong to the passions, and reason's role is merely instrumental, serving the passions by discovering means to satisfy them. This inverts the picture that philosophers had promoted for millennia. The traditional view held that reason should govern the passions, that rational deliberation should determine what we desire and pursue, that a well-ordered soul places intellect in command and emotions in subservience. Plato compared reason to a charioteer controlling unruly horses of passion. The Stoics urged the suppression of passion through rational discipline. Even religious traditions typically elevated reason or spirit above bodily appetites and emotions. But Hume observes that this traditional picture misunderstands the actual functions of reason and passion. Reason can discover truth and falsehood. It can determine matters of fact and relations between ideas. It can trace causal connections, perform calculations, deduce conclusions from premises, but it cannot by itself motivate any action whatsoever. A proposition known through reason remains motivationally inert unless connected to some passion or desire that gives us a reason to act on it. Think about how motivation actually works. You don't act merely because you know something is true. You act because you desire something, fear something, hope for something. Reason can inform you that eating will relieve your hunger, but reason alone doesn't make you eat. You eat because you desire to relieve hunger, and reason merely shows you how to satisfy this desire. Reason can reveal that studying will help you pass an exam, but reason alone doesn't motivate studying. You study because you desire to pass the exam, fear failure, or hope for advancement, and reason serves these passions by identifying effective means. The passions, for Hume, include all emotions, desires, aversions, inclinations, anything that moves us to action. They are impressions of reflection, arising in response to ideas and other impressions. When you contemplate something pleasant, desire arises. When you contemplate something painful, aversion arises. These passions are original existences, not copies of anything, not true or false, not subject to rational evaluation in themselves. A desire is neither reasonable nor unreasonable, it simply is. This leads to a striking conclusion. It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of one's finger. This sounds monstrous, but Hume is making a logical point, not endorsing such a preference. He is saying that preferences themselves cannot be irrational. Reason can correct false beliefs about means and ends. If you desire something under a mistaken belief about what it is, reason can correct this belief. But reason cannot criticize the ultimate ends themselves. That you care more about avoiding a scratch than about the world's survival is not a rational error, but an admittedly perverse preference. Of course, Hume recognizes that no one actually has such a preference. Human nature gives us passions that generally align with survival and flourishing. We care about our own well-being, sympathize with others' suffering, desire social harmony. These natural passions, not rational principles, guide moral life. What appears as moral reasoning is usually reason serving moral passions, discovering facts relevant to moral judgment, tracing consequences of actions, but always in service of underlying moral sentiments. Consider what this means for the possibility of weakness of will. The traditional picture holds that weakness of will occurs when passion overwhelms reason, when we act on desire despite knowing better. But for Hume, this is backwards. All action is motivated by passion. What we call weakness of will is simply one passion overcoming another, a strong immediate desire defeating a weaker long-term concern. Reason doesn't fight against passion. It serves whichever passion proves strongest. The passions divide into direct and indirect. Direct passions arise immediately from pleasure and pain, desire, aversion, joy, grief, hope, fear. Indirect passions involve more complex psychological mechanisms: pride, humility, love, hatred, ambition. These indirect passions form when we contemplate qualities related to ourselves or others that produce pleasure or pain. We'll explore these indirect passions more carefully shortly, but the key point is that both direct and indirect passions, not reason, provide the ultimate springs of action. This doesn't mean we should abandon reasoning or cultivate irrational passions. It means understanding reason's proper role. Reason is invaluable for discovering facts, tracing consequences, identifying means to satisfy our desires, but it cannot determine what we should ultimately desire or value. Those determinations come from passion, specifically from the natural passions that constitute human nature and the refined passions shaped by experience and sympathy. Hume's elevation of passion over reason might seem to promote irrationality or moral chaos, but he's actually promoting psychological realism. He asks us to recognize how motivation actually works, rather than accepting a flattering but false picture of pure reason governing action. And he suggests that morality is grounded more securely in natural human sentiments than it could ever be in abstract rational principles that lack any intrinsic connection to motivation. What remains is a picture of human nature in which passion and reason both play essential but distinct roles. Passion provides the goals, the motivation, the ultimate ends. Reason provides the map, showing pathways from current states to desired states, revealing consequences and connections. Together they enable human action, neither enslaving the other, but each contributing what the other cannot provide. And in acknowledging passion's supremacy in motivation, we achieve clearer understanding of moral psychology than any amount of rationalist mythology could deliver. Pride and humility. There is a family of emotions that occupies Hume's attention with particular intensity, emotions that involve the self as both subject and object. Pride and humility are not merely feelings, but complex psychological phenomena that reveal how we relate to ourselves, how we construct a sense of identity through emotional responses to our qualities and circumstances. These indirect passions, as Hume calls them, operate through an elaborate mechanism that connects the self to the sources of these emotions through intermediate ideas and impressions. Pride is a pleasant feeling directed at oneself, arising when we contemplate some quality, possession, or relation connected to us that we consider valuable or admirable. You feel pride in your accomplishments, your talents, your possessions, your relationships, your nation or family. The emotion is not merely generic pleasure, but pleasure specifically focused on yourself as its object. You don't just feel good, you feel good about yourself in relation to whatever triggers the pride. Humility, conversely, is an unpleasant feeling directed at oneself, arising when we contemplate something connected to us that we consider deficient or shameful. You feel humility or shame about your failures, your flaws, your poverty, your disgraces. The emotion is painful, and like pride, it focuses specifically on the self. You don't just feel bad, you feel bad about yourself in relation to whatever triggers the humility. Think about the complexity of these passions. Pride requires four elements working together: a quality that produces pleasure, a connection between that quality and yourself, the idea of yourself, and the pleasant feeling of pride directed at that idea of yourself. Suppose you write a beautiful poem. The poem's beauty produces pleasure. The poem is yours, connected to you as its creator. You have an idea of yourself as the one who created this beautiful thing. And from all this arises the specific feeling of pride, pleasure in yourself, arising from contemplation of your connection to this pleasing quality. The mechanism operates through what Hume calls a double relation of impressions and ideas. The quality that occasions pride produces a pleasant impression. The self produces a related pleasant impression through pride. The quality is related to the self through some connection: ownership, causation, resemblance. These relations and associations guide the mind from perceiving the quality to feeling pride in oneself. The system is elegant and explains why only certain things produce pride. They must be connected to us and must produce pleasure independent of that connection. Humility works through the same mechanism but with pain rather than pleasure. A personal failure produces pain. The failure is connected to you. The idea of yourself becomes associated with this painful impression. And humility arises, pain focused on yourself arising from contemplation of your connection to this displeasing quality. The double relation again guides the transition from perceiving a negative quality to feeling humility about oneself. Consider how varied the sources of pride and humility can be. We take pride in our bodies when beautiful, our minds when clever, our possessions when fine, our children when accomplished, our nation when powerful. The connection to self can be causal. We created something. Ownership, it belongs to us. Resemblance, it shares qualities with us. Or mere association, it is frequently connected to us. Human psychology is remarkably flexible in what it can incorporate into the sense of self for purposes of pride and humility. But why do we feel pride and humility at all? Hume suggests these passions serve important psychological and social functions. Pride encourages us to develop our talents, acquire valuable qualities, maintain our reputation. Humility motivates us to correct our flaws, avoid disgrace, present ourselves acceptably in society. Both passions regulate behavior by making us care about the qualities and circumstances connected to us, by giving us emotional stakes in how we appear to ourselves and others. The relationship between pride and the self is complex. Pride arises when we contemplate ourselves in relation to admirable connected qualities. But pride also shapes our conception of ourselves. We come to identify with the sources of our pride, to see ourselves as essentially characterized by these qualities. The person proud of their intellect comes to think of themselves as fundamentally an intellectual. The one proud of their beauty identifies themselves with their appearance. Pride doesn't just respond to the self, it helps constitute how we understand the self. Hume notes that pride and humility can be excessive or deficient. Excessive pride becomes arrogance or vanity, finding grounds for self-satisfaction in trivial qualities or taking too much credit for advantages due to luck. Excessive humility becomes paralyzing shame or false modesty. The well-adjusted person feels pride and humility proportionate to their actual qualities and circumstances, neither inflating nor deflating their self-assessment beyond what the facts warrant. Think about how social context shapes these passions. What produces pride in one society might produce humility in another. Different cultures value different qualities, establish different standards for what counts as admirable or shameful. Yet the mechanism Hume identifies, the double relation of impressions and ideas connecting pleasing or painful qualities to the self, operates universally across these cultural variations. The structure of pride and humility is constant even as their specific content varies. These passions also connect deeply to our relations with others. The pride we feel in ourselves often depends on how we imagine others perceive us. We desire their admiration and fear their contempt. This anticipation of others' judgments shapes what qualities we take pride in and what qualities produce humility. The self revealed through pride and humility is always partly a social self, constituted through actual and imagined responses of others. What Hume reveals is that even our most personal emotions, feelings about ourselves, operate through complex psychological mechanisms involving associations, relations, and the interplay of pleasure and pain. Pride and humility are not simple or self-explanatory, but require careful analysis to understand. And in understanding them, we gain insight into how the self is constructed through emotional responses to the qualities and circumstances that life presents us. The indirect passions. There is a whole class of emotions that arise not immediately from pleasure and pain, but through complex psychological pathways involving the self and others. Hume calls these the indirect passions, and they include some of our most powerful and socially significant emotions: pride, humility, love, and hatred. These passions differ from direct passions like joy or grief in their structure. They require intermediate steps involving relations between ideas and the interplay of multiple impressions before the characteristic emotion emerges. We have already explored pride and humility, those self-directed passions that arise when we contemplate qualities connected to ourselves. But Hume identifies a parallel structure in our emotions toward others. Love and hatred are to other people what pride and humility are to ourselves. Just as pride is pleasant emotion directed at the self, love is pleasant emotion directed at another person. Just as humility is painful emotion directed at the self, hatred is painful emotion directed at another. Love in Hume's technical sense is not romantic attachment or familial affection, though it includes these. It is the general pleasant feeling we have towards someone when we contemplate qualities connected to them that produce pleasure. You feel love towards someone whose character you admire, whose accomplishments impress you, whose beauty pleases you, whose kindness benefits you. The emotion is directed at the person as its object, arising from pleasant contemplation of qualities related to them. Hatred operates through the inverse mechanism. It is the painful feeling directed at someone when we contemplate displeasing qualities connected to them. You feel hatred towards someone whose character is vicious, whose actions harm you, whose presence produces discomfort. The emotion focuses on the person, arising from painful contemplation of their qualities or their relation to you. Think about the elaborate mechanism Hume proposes. For love to arise, several elements must come together: a quality that produces pleasure, a person to whom that quality is related, the idea of that person as distinct from yourself, and the pleasant feeling of love directed toward the idea of that person. The mind moves from perceiving a pleasing quality through the relation connecting it to a person, arriving finally at the emotion of love for that person. The process mirrors the mechanism of pride, but directs the resulting emotion outward rather than inward. The same double relation of impressions and ideas operates here. The admirable quality produces pleasure. The person produces related pleasure through love. The quality is connected to the person through causation, resemblance, or contiguity. These relations guide the transition from perceiving the quality to feeling love for the person possessing or connected to it. Without these relations properly aligned, the passion does not arise. We might admire a quality without loving the person who possesses it if we see no clear connection between them. Consider how this explains various phenomena of love and hatred. We love those who benefit us because their beneficial actions are both pleasant and clearly caused by them. We love the beautiful because their beauty pleases us and is intimately connected to their person. We love those who resemble us or our loved ones because resemblance creates association that transfers pleasant feeling. We love those frequently in our presence because contiguity strengthens the connection between them and sources of pleasure in our environment. Hatred operates through parallel but inverted paths. We hate those who harm us because their harmful actions are both painful and caused by them. We hate those whose character traits produce disgust or fear because these traits are inherent to them and reliably produce painful impressions. We hate those who threaten what we value because they are connected as causes to anticipated pain. The mechanisms are precise and predictable once we understand the psychological principles governing association and the passions. But these indirect passions involve complications that direct passions do not. A single person might produce both love and hatred through different qualities or at different times. You might love someone for their kindness while hating them for their betrayal. You might feel pride in one aspect of yourself while feeling humility about another. The indirect passions admit of mixture and conflict in ways that reveal the complexity of human emotional life. Hume also identifies what he calls the indirect passions' tendency toward comparison and relative judgment. We feel pride not merely from possessing good qualities, but from possessing qualities superior to those around us. We feel love not only for the absolutely admirable, but for those who excel relative to common standards. This comparative dimension makes these passions inherently social, always referencing not just absolute qualities, but one's standing relative to others. Think about how this plays out in jealousy and envy, passions Hume analyzes as mixtures of love, hatred, pride, and humility operating in complex patterns. Jealousy arises when someone we love is loved by another, threatening our special connection to them. It involves love for the person, hatred for the rival, and humility arising from the comparison to the rival who also attracts our beloved's attention. Multiple indirect passions interact, creating the characteristic painful mixture we call jealousy. Envy emerges when we compare ourselves unfavorably to another in some dimension we value. It combines humility from recognizing our inferiority, hatred toward the superior person, and disturbed pride that seeks to maintain self-esteem, despite the unfavorable comparison. The passion is complex precisely because it activates multiple mechanisms simultaneously, each contributing to the overall emotional experience. The indirect passions also exhibit what Hume calls a tendency to spread or extend themselves. Love for a person naturally extends to things closely connected to that person. We value their possessions, admire their creations, feel fondly toward their family and friends. Hatred similarly spreads to encompass everything associated with the hated person. This extension through association explains how passions can seem to grow beyond their original objects, creating webs of emotion connecting multiple people and things. What makes these passions indirect is precisely this complex psychological pathway they traverse. Direct passions arise immediately when we experience pleasure or pain. You feel joy directly from good news, fear directly from perceived danger. But indirect passions require the mind to move through multiple steps, perceiving a quality, recognizing its connection to a person's self or other, forming the idea of that person, and then experiencing the characteristic emotion directed at that person. The indirection involves this mental journey from quality to person to passion. Hume's analysis reveals that even emotions we might think of as simple or immediate actually involve elaborate psychological machinery. Love and hatred are not random feelings but emerge predictably from the interaction of pleasure and pain, with our ideas of persons and the relations connecting qualities to persons. Understanding this machinery helps explain when and why we feel these powerful social emotions, how they can be cultivated or diminished, and why they play such crucial roles in social life. The indirect passions bind us to others and to ourselves through emotional attachments structured by pleasure and pain. They create the web of social connection, the patterns of attraction and aversion that organize human communities. And in analyzing their mechanisms, Hume provides a naturalistic account of emotions that traditional philosophy had treated as mysterious or inexplicable, showing that even our most intense feelings operate according to discoverable psychological principles. Liberty and necessity reconciled. There is a debate that seems to threaten the very foundations of morality and human dignity. Are human actions free, arising from choices we could have made otherwise, or are they determined by prior causes, links in an unbreakable chain of necessity extending back through history? The quarrel between defenders of free will and advocates of determinism has consumed philosophy for centuries. Yet Hume suggests that this ancient dispute rests on confusion, that liberty and necessity are not actually opposed, and that both can be true of human action simultaneously. The key is to clarify what we mean by necessity. When we say that physical events happen by necessity, what do we actually observe? We see constant conjunction. Objects of one type are always followed by objects of another type. Struck balls always move. Heated water always evaporates. The necessity we attribute to these sequences is not something observed in the events themselves, but an expectation formed in our minds through custom. We have seen these sequences so often that we cannot help but expect them to continue. Now consider human actions. Do they exhibit the same kind of constant conjunction? Hume argues that they clearly do. Certain motives in certain circumstances regularly produce certain actions. An ambitious person in a position of power reliably pursues advancement. A benevolent person who witnesses suffering reliably offers help. A greedy person presented with easy profit reliably takes it. Human behavior exhibits patterns as regular as those in physical nature, allowing us to predict actions based on character and circumstances. This regularity is precisely what makes human interaction possible. We trust others because we expect their actions to follow from their characters and motives in predictable ways. We make promises because we expect others to feel bound by commitments. We form plans involving other people because we can anticipate how they will behave. If human action were truly random and unpredictable, uncaused by motives and circumstances, social life would collapse into chaos. Think about what we mean when we call an action free. We don't mean that it happened without any cause. We mean that it arose from the person's will, from their own desires and decisions, rather than from external compulsion. The free action is one that flows from the agent's character, motives, and choices. The unfree action is one imposed by force, extracted through coercion, or produced by circumstances that bypass the agent's will entirely. This is the sense in which liberty and necessity are compatible. All actions, including free ones, have causes. They arise from motives, character, circumstances working together. This is necessity, understood as regular causal connection. But some actions arise from internal causes, the agent's will, while others arise from external compulsion. The former are free, the latter are unfree. Freedom is not absence of causation, but a particular kind of causation, one that operates through the agent's own mental states. Hume argues that this compatibilist position preserves everything important about freedom while acknowledging the causal structure of human action. We can hold people responsible for their free actions because those actions express their character and flow from their choices. We can praise and blame, reward and punish, because these responses influence the very motives and character traits that cause future actions. Moral evaluation makes sense precisely because human action is causally regular, character and circumstances reliably produce behavior. Consider what happens to responsibility if actions are truly uncaused. If your choice arose from nothing, emerging randomly without connection to your character, motives, or reasons, why should you be held accountable for it? It would not express who you are or what you care about. It would be an inexplicable event that happened to occur in your body, but bore no meaningful relation to you as a person. True randomness in action would eliminate responsibility, not establish it. The confusion in the free will debate, Hume suggests, comes from imagining two meanings of necessity, one operating in nature, another in mind. We think physical necessity is strong and genuine, while mental causation is weaker or different in kind. But this distinction lacks foundation. The necessity in both realms consists entirely in constant conjunction observed and expectation formed through custom. Motives produce actions as regularly as physical causes produce physical effects. The necessitation is the same. This does not mean human beings are mere machines, or that behavior is perfectly predictable. Character is complex, circumstances vary infinitely, and our knowledge of both is always limited. We cannot predict human action with the precision we predict planetary motion, but this reflects epistemic limitations rather than absence of causal determination. In principle, with perfect knowledge of character and circumstances, human action would be as predictable as any physical event. Think about the implications for punishment and praise. We punish actions because punishment affects future behavior by influencing motives. We praise virtue because praise reinforces character traits that produce beneficial actions. These practices make sense only if actions flow causally from character and motives, only if influencing these mental states reliably influences behavior. A world of genuinely uncaused actions would be one where moral education, punishment, and reward were pointless, since they could not causally influence what people do. Some worry that this view makes us puppets of circumstance, unable to genuinely choose or create ourselves. But Hume responds that we are the circumstances, or at least our character and motives are among the causes producing our actions. You are not compelled by something external when you act from your own desires and beliefs. You are expressing yourself, even if yourself has itself been shaped by prior causes. The causal chain runs through you, and this passage through your mental states is what makes actions yours and makes you responsible for them. The liberty-necessity debate dissolves once we clarify terms. Necessity is not fate imposed from outside, but regular causal connection observed in experience. Liberty is not uncaused action, but action arising from the agent's will rather than external compulsion. Both are true of human behavior. Our actions are caused by our character and circumstances, necessity, and express our own choices and motives, liberty. There is no contradiction, only confusion about what these terms mean. What remains is a naturalistic account of human action, one that sees behavior as part of the causal order while preserving moral responsibility and the meaningful distinction between free and compelled action. We are neither cosmic exceptions to causation, nor mere billiard balls bouncing according to physical laws. We are beings whose actions arise through the distinctive causal mechanisms of motive, desire, belief, and character, and this is sufficient for freedom. The problem of personal identity. There is a question that returns us to the mystery of the self, approaching it from a new angle. Not merely what the self is, but how it persists through time. What makes you the same person today that you were years ago, despite all the changes you have undergone? Your body has changed, your thoughts and memories are different, your character may have developed in significant ways. In what does your continuing identity consist? Hume examines this question and finds that personal identity is not what we typically imagine it to be. Traditional philosophy posited a substantial self, a soul or underlying substance that persists unchanged through all the varying experiences of a lifetime. This substantial self would be the thread of identity, the same thing existing at every moment of your life, providing continuity beneath the flux of changing perceptions. But Hume, applying his empiricist method, asks from what impression is this idea of substantial self derived? And when we look honestly, we find no such impression. We have already explored Hume's bundle theory. The self is nothing but a collection of perceptions with no underlying substance. But this raises the problem of personal identity acutely. If the self is just perceptions, and perceptions are constantly changing, what accounts for the sense of continuous identity? Why do we feel like the same person persisting through time rather than a series of different selves, each existing only momentarily? Hume's answer appeals to psychological continuity created by memory and causation. Memory connects present perceptions to past ones by allowing us to recall former experiences and attribute them to ourselves. You remember your childhood, and this memory creates the impression that the person who had those childhood experiences is the same person who now remembers them. The chain of memory linking past to present generates the feeling of continuous identity. Think about how memory works in creating this sense of self. You don't just remember isolated events. You remember them as your events, as things that happened to you. And this attribution of past experiences to yourself creates a narrative of continuous existence, a story in which you persist as the protagonist despite all the changes in your circumstances and experiences. Memory is the mechanism that ties together the bundle of perceptions across time, making them seem like perceptions of a single persisting self. But memory alone is not sufficient. Causation also plays a crucial role. Your present perceptions and dispositions are causally connected to past perceptions and dispositions. Earlier experiences shape later ones. Habits formed in youth persist into age. Decisions made yesterday constrain options available today. These causal connections create real continuity in the bundle of perceptions, making the later perceptions genuinely related to earlier ones rather than merely arbitrarily associated. Consider the analogy Hume uses, a river that constantly changes its water while remaining the same river. The river maintains identity, not through some unchanging underlying substance, but through continuity of flow, with each drop of water causally connected to previous drops, the whole system maintaining a pattern despite constant material change. Similarly, personal identity consists in the continuous flow of causally connected perceptions, each arising from and leading to others, creating a pattern we recognize as a persisting self. Yet Hume admits serious problems with this account. What unifies the bundle of perceptions? What makes these particular perceptions my perceptions rather than someone else's or just a random collection? Memory and causation create connections among perceptions, but they don't explain what groups certain connected perceptions together as constituting one person rather than another. The problem of unity remains unsolved. In a rare moment of philosophical humility, Hume confesses in an appendix to his treatise that his account of personal identity leads to contradictions he cannot resolve. He acknowledges that his principles seem to entail both that the self is nothing but a bundle of connected perceptions, and that there must be something that possesses these perceptions, something that ties them together. He finds himself in a labyrinth from which he sees no escape. Think about what makes this problem so difficult. On one hand, empiricism seems to rule out any substantial self beyond the perceptions we actually experience. On the other hand, mere connections among perceptions don't seem sufficient to explain the unity of consciousness, the fact that these various perceptions are all experienced by a single subject. We need some account of what groups perceptions together as belonging to one person, but empiricism provides no impression from which such a unifying principle could be derived. Perhaps the difficulty reveals something important. Personal identity is not the sort of thing that admits of precise philosophical analysis. The self is not a simple perceivable entity, but an emergent phenomenon arising from complex psychological processes. Our sense of continuous identity is produced by memory, causation, and narrative construction, even though there may be no metaphysical fact of the matter about what makes us the same person over time. Modern discussions of personal identity continue to grapple with problems Hume identified. Thought experiments about brain transplants, gradual replacement of neurons, splitting and merging of persons, all these reveal that our intuitive concept of personal identity may not correspond to any precise metaphysical reality. Perhaps there is no unique correct answer to when someone continues to exist and when they cease to exist, only pragmatic decisions about how to apply the concept of identity in different contexts. What Hume's struggle with personal identity suggests is that the self is more mysterious and elusive than common sense assumes. We are not simple, enduring substances, but complex, changing processes. The feeling of continuous identity may be more psychological fiction than metaphysical fact, a story we tell ourselves that serves practical purposes, even if it doesn't correspond to any substantial reality. And in recognizing the problematic nature of personal identity, we confront one of philosophy's most persistent and troubling puzzles: memory as the thread of selfhood. There is a capacity that seems essential to having a life at all, a faculty that allows us to transcend the present moment and connect our current experience to the vast span of past moments that constitute our history. Memory is not merely storage of information, but the very foundation of personal identity, the mechanism that creates the sense of a continuous self persisting through time. Hume recognizes memory's crucial role in constructing the narrative of selfhood, even as he acknowledges the philosophical puzzles it raises. Without memory, we would be locked in the eternal present, experiencing each moment in isolation from all others. We would have no sense of a personal past, no autobiography, no feeling of being the same person who inhabited earlier moments. Each instant of consciousness would stand alone, unconnected to what came before or what might come after. Memory transforms this disconnected sequence into a unified life, linking present awareness to past experiences through the act of remembering. Think about how memory operates in everyday experience. You wake in the morning and immediately know who you are, where you are, what you were doing yesterday. This knowledge is not reasoned out, but arises automatically from memory's integration of past and present. You recognize your surroundings, recall your relationships, remember your ongoing projects and commitments. All of this depends on memory connecting current perceptions to the accumulated store of past experiences. Hume identifies memory as the source of our idea of personal identity over time. We remember past experiences and naturally attribute them to ourselves, to the same I that now remembers them. This attribution creates the impression of a continuous self. You remember your 10th birthday, your first day of school, what you did last Tuesday. In remembering these experiences as yours, as things that happened to you, you construct a narrative of continuous existence spanning from past to present. But memory's role in personal identity raises difficult questions. What about forgotten experiences? If you have no memory of something that happened to you as an infant, does that mean the infant was not you? If a person develops amnesia and loses all memory of their former life, do they become a different person? The connection between memory and identity seems both too strong and too weak. Too strong because we want to say forgotten experiences still belong to us. Too weak because memory alone doesn't seem to fully constitute identity. Consider also that memory is notoriously unreliable. We misremember, confabulate, unconsciously alter past experiences in recollection. Studies show that each time we remember something, we potentially change the memory itself. If personal identity rests on memory, and memory is so malleable and error-prone, what becomes of the stability of the self? Perhaps we are constantly rewriting our past, constructing and reconstructing our identity through the act of remembering. Hume recognizes another function of memory beyond simple recollection. Memory allows us to trace causal connections between past and present, to see how earlier experiences shaped later ones, how past decisions constrain present options, how character developed through accumulated experience. This awareness of causal continuity reinforces the sense of personal identity. You are not just someone who remembers a past experience, but someone whose current state was causally produced by that experience and everything that followed. Think about how this works in practical life. You understand your current abilities as products of past learning and practice. You explain your present attitudes and preferences by reference to past experiences that shape them. You see your relationships as having histories that influence their current character. All of this depends on memory revealing the causal threads connecting past to present, showing how what you were contributed to what you are. But memory extends beyond personal past to encompass what we might call extended identity. You remember not just your own experiences, but stories told by others, historical events you learned about, cultural narratives you absorbed. These memories shape your sense of who you are, even though they don't represent your direct experience. You might identify as Scottish, as Christian, as a philosopher, as part of a family tradition, all identities constituted partly through memory of things you did not personally experience. This suggests that personal identity is not purely individual but also social and cultural. The self you remember yourself to be is partly constructed from collective memories, shared narratives, cultural frameworks that pre-exist your individual experience. Memory is not a private archive but a social practice, shaped by how communities remember and what they choose to preserve or forget. Your identity is woven from threads that extend beyond your individual consciousness into the social fabric. Hume also notes that memory has a peculiar epistemic status. When you remember something, the memory carries a feeling of reality, a sense that what you remember actually happened. This feeling distinguishes memory from imagination. Both involve ideas of absent things, but memory's ideas seem to refer to real past events, while imagination's ideas are recognized as mere fancy, yet this feeling can deceive us. False memories feel just as real as accurate ones. The subjective certainty of memory provides no guarantee of its truth. Consider the implications for self-knowledge. If we know ourselves primarily through memory, and memory is both selective and unreliable, how well do we actually know ourselves? We construct our self-understanding from memories that may be incomplete, distorted, or simply false. The autobiographical narrative we tell ourselves about who we are rests on a foundation that shifts beneath us, constantly being revised and rewritten. Yet despite these problems, memory remains indispensable for personal identity. Even if memories are imperfect, even if the self they construct is partly fictional, we cannot have a sense of continuous existence without memory connecting present to past. The alternative would be to live in the eternal present, experiencing each moment as new and disconnected, with no sense of a life extending through time. Hume's analysis reveals memory as simultaneously essential and problematic for personal identity. It is the primary mechanism creating the sense of a continuous self, yet it operates imperfectly and raises questions about the reality of the identity it constructs. We are the stories we remember ourselves to be, but these stories are always provisional, always being revised, always dependent on the unreliable faculty of memory that both reveals and conceals our past. Perhaps what this suggests is that personal identity is not a fixed fact, but an ongoing achievement. We are constantly creating ourselves through the act of remembering, selecting which experiences to emphasize and which to forget, constructing narratives that give shape to the flow of experience. The self is less a thing we discover than a story we tell, and memory is the storyteller's art. The limits of human understanding. There is a boundary beyond which human knowledge cannot extend, a horizon that marks the limits of what experience can teach us. Hume dedicates himself to mapping this boundary, to showing precisely where legitimate inquiry ends and empty speculation begins. His empiricism is not merely a theory of knowledge, but a discipline of intellectual modesty, a commitment to acknowledge what we cannot know rather than pretend to knowledge we do not possess. The limits of understanding follow directly from Hume's theory of ideas. Since all ideas derive from impressions, we cannot form meaningful ideas of anything that transcends possible experience. We can combine and modify ideas derived from experience in various ways, but we cannot generate genuinely new content that does not ultimately trace back to sensory impressions or impressions of reflection. This constrains understanding to the experiential realm, ruling out knowledge of whatever lies beyond experience reach. Consider what this excludes. We cannot have knowledge of substance underlying the properties we perceive. We observe colors, shapes, textures, but never the substance supposedly supporting these qualities. We cannot know necessary connections between causes and effects, since we observe only constant conjunction. We cannot have knowledge of the soul as a simple immaterial substance, since we experience only particular thoughts and feelings, never the soul itself. We cannot know God's nature through reason, since God transcends any possible experience. These are not trivial limitations. They touch the central concerns of traditional metaphysics: substance, causation, the soul, God. Hume's empiricism suggests that these traditional topics lie beyond the bounds of genuine knowledge. We can form words relating to them, construct sentences that seem meaningful, develop elaborate theories. But if these theories do not trace back to actual impressions, they amount to empty verbiage, sounds without genuine content. Think about what this means for philosophy as traditionally practiced. Much of historical philosophy consisted in making claims about reality that transcended possible experience: the ultimate nature of substance, the structure of reality in itself, the characteristics of immaterial souls, the attributes of perfect beings. Hume's empiricism suggests that most of this philosophy is meaningless, that philosophers have been debating questions that admit of no answers because the terms involved refer to nothing in actual or possible experience. But the limits of understanding are not entirely negative. They also protect us from error. By acknowledging what we cannot know, we avoid false claims to knowledge. By restricting inquiry to what experience can address, we focus our efforts where they can actually produce results. Hume's skepticism about metaphysics is meant to redirect philosophy toward more profitable pursuits, toward careful observation of human nature, toward understanding the psychological mechanisms that govern belief and action, toward investigating the empirical foundations of morality and society. The limit is not arbitrary, but principled. We can know what experience teaches us through perception and introspection. We can trace causal regularities through repeated observation. We can understand human nature through careful attention to our own mental operations and those of others. But we cannot know reality as it is independent of experience, cannot penetrate to essences hidden behind appearances, cannot deduce the nature of the universe from pure reason. Experience sets the boundary of possible knowledge. Consider how this affects specific domains of inquiry. In natural science, we can discover laws describing regular patterns in observable phenomena. We cannot discover the ultimate essence of matter or the necessary reasons why nature operates as it does. In psychology, we can observe mental operations and trace associations among ideas. We cannot discover an immaterial soul underlying these operations. In theology, we can study religious experience and natural beliefs about the divine. We cannot prove God's existence through abstract argument or determine God's attributes through reason. Hume divides all objects of human understanding into two categories: relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas include mathematics and logic, domains where propositions can be known with certainty through reason alone, because they concern only the relations among our ideas rather than making claims about existence. Matters of fact concern what actually exists and what happens in the world, domains where knowledge depends on experience and can never achieve absolute certainty. This division, sometimes called Hume's fork, has become fundamental to empiricist philosophy. It suggests that necessity and certainty are available only in formal domains, like mathematics, where we are merely exploring the implications of definitions and conventions. Claims about the actual world can never be known with certainty because they depend on experience, and experience always admits of alternatives. We might observe that the sun has always risen, but we cannot know with certainty that it must rise tomorrow. Think about questions that fall between the two prongs of Hume's fork, questions that seem to be about matters of fact, but are framed as though they admit of the certainty appropriate to relations of ideas. These are precisely the metaphysical questions that lie beyond the limits of understanding. They attempt to extend the certainty of logic to claims about existence, to derive necessary truths about reality from pure reason. But this attempt must fail, because existence claims require empirical justification that can never achieve certainty. The recognition of limits does not counsel despair about knowledge. We can know a great deal within the bounds of experience. Science progresses through careful observation and inductive inference. Psychology develops through introspective awareness and comparative study of behavior. Morality rests on natural sentiments that we can study empirically. The limits of understanding restrict metaphysical speculation while leaving ample room for legitimate inquiry into accessible domains. What Hume offers is intellectual humility without skeptical paralysis. We acknowledge what we cannot know while pursuing knowledge where it is genuinely possible. We give up pretensions to absolute certainty about existence while accepting the practical certainty that custom and repeated experience provide. We abandon empty metaphysical speculation while embracing careful empirical investigation of human nature and the observable world. The limits of understanding mark not merely what we cannot know, but what it makes no sense to claim to know. Beyond these limits lie not difficult truths awaiting discovery, but pseudo-questions masquerading as genuine inquiries. And in recognizing this, we free ourselves from fruitless debates, redirecting intellectual energy toward questions that admit of answers grounded in actual human experience. Skepticism as philosophical cure. There is a form of doubt that seems destructive, corroding all belief until nothing remains but uncertainty. Yet Hume proposes a different kind of skepticism, one that serves not to paralyze thought, but to cure philosophy of its dogmatic pretensions. This mitigated skepticism accepts that some beliefs cannot be rationally justified, yet recognizes that we cannot help holding them. It acknowledges uncertainty while embracing the natural beliefs that guide human life, finding freedom not in achieving certainty, but in accepting its absence. Hume distinguishes between excessive and moderate skepticism. Excessive skepticism, what he calls Pyrrhonian skepticism, after ancient Greek skeptics, doubts everything, refusing assent to any belief that lacks conclusive proof. This radical doubt, Hume argues, is psychologically impossible to maintain. Nature simply will not allow such complete suspension of judgment. The moment the skeptic leaves their study and engages with life, they find themselves believing in the external world, trusting causation, acting on expectations about the future, despite their inability to rationally justify these beliefs. Moderate or mitigated skepticism, by contrast, is both philosophically coherent and practically beneficial. It involves recognizing the limits of what we can know with certainty while accepting the natural beliefs that custom and instinct provide. We cannot prove that induction is valid, but we cannot help reasoning inductively. We cannot demonstrate the external world's existence, but we naturally believe in it anyway. Mitigated skepticism accepts this situation without either pretending to certainty we lack or succumbing to paralyzing doubt. Think about the therapeutic function of this skepticism. It cures philosophy of excessive confidence, of the dogmatic claim to have discovered absolute truths about reality. It prevents us from building elaborate metaphysical systems on foundations that cannot support them. It makes us modest in our claims, careful in our assertions, humble about what we actually know versus what we merely believe. This modesty is healthy, protecting us from the errors that arise when speculation outreaches evidence. The mitigated skeptic becomes a better inquirer precisely by acknowledging uncertainty. Rather than defending established positions dogmatically, they remain open to evidence and argument. Rather than claiming to have reached final truth, they treat conclusions as provisional, subject to revision in light of new experience. Rather than dismissing challenges to their views, they examine them seriously, recognizing that their current beliefs might be mistaken. Hume also emphasizes skepticism's value in moderating passion and promoting calm reflection. When we recognize how little we can know with certainty, when we acknowledge that even our most confident beliefs rest on foundations we cannot secure through reason, we become less inclined to dogmatic assertion and intemperate dispute. The recognition of universal uncertainty promotes intellectual tolerance, making us less likely to persecute others for disagreement or to assume our views must be correct while theirs are obviously false. Consider how this applies to religious and metaphysical disputes. Throughout history, people have killed and been killed over doctrines that Hume's empiricism reveals to be beyond the reach of knowledge. Theological claims about God's nature, metaphysical theories about the ultimate structure of reality, these admit of no conclusive evidence, yet people treat them as absolute truths worth fighting over. Mitigated skepticism suggests that such disputes involve not knowledge, but speculation, not discoverable fact but matters beyond human understanding. This recognition should moderate the passion with which we hold such beliefs. The skeptical attitude also directs inquiry toward more tractable questions. Instead of debating whether there exists a substantial self underlying our perceptions, we investigate how the sense of personal identity actually arises in human psychology. Instead of arguing about whether causation involves necessary connection, we study how humans form causal beliefs and what functions these beliefs serve. Skepticism about unanswerable metaphysical questions redirects attention to empirical questions about human nature that we can actually investigate. But Hume insists that skepticism must itself be moderate. Excessive skepticism becomes self-defeating and impractical. We cannot actually suspend all belief or refuse to act without justification. Life requires that we trust our senses, believe in causation, expect the future to resemble the past, all beliefs that strict skepticism would rule out. The mitigated skeptic recognizes that nature forces certain beliefs upon us and accepts this as part of the human condition rather than fighting against it. Think about the balance Hume proposes. In the study, we can entertain skeptical doubts, recognize the limits of what reason can prove, acknowledge how many of our beliefs rest on custom rather than logic. But in practical life, we set aside these doubts and act on the beliefs that nature provides, trusting the regularities that experience has revealed, even while recognizing philosophically that this trust cannot be rationally justified. We live as if certain beliefs are true, while philosophically acknowledging that we cannot prove their truth. This might seem intellectually dishonest, professing skepticism in theory while assuming certainty in practice. But Hume sees it as accepting the human condition honestly. We are beings for whom certain beliefs are natural and unavoidable, yet these beliefs cannot be proven through reason. Rather than pretending either that we can prove them or that we can abandon them, mitigated skepticism acknowledges both their rational unprovability and their psychological inevitability. The ultimate value of Hume's skepticism is that it makes us better thinkers without making us unable to think. It cultivates intellectual humility without producing practical paralysis. It shows us the limits of reason without leaving us helpless before those limits. And it suggests that wisdom consists not in achieving certainty, but in learning to live well with uncertainty, accepting the beliefs that nature gives us while remaining modest about how much we actually know. Skepticism, properly understood, is not philosophy's enemy but its cure, a medicine that purges dogmatic excess while preserving the natural beliefs essential for human life. The natural belief in the external world. There is a belief so fundamental that we rarely notice we hold it, a conviction that operates constantly beneath conscious awareness. You believe that objects continue to exist when you are not perceiving them. You assume that the chair remains in the room when you leave, that the tree stands in the forest whether anyone observes it, that the world persists independent of your experience. This belief in the external world seems obvious, undeniable, yet Hume asks a disturbing question: what justifies this belief? And his answer is equally disturbing: nothing does. The belief is natural but not rational, produced by imagination rather than justified by reason. Consider what you actually experience. You perceive sensations, colors, shapes, sounds, textures. These sensations exist in your consciousness when you experience them. But do they prove that external objects exist independent of your perception? When you see a table, you experience certain visual impressions. When you touch it, you experience tactile impressions. But the table itself, the object supposedly causing these impressions, is never directly perceived. You experience only your own sensations, never the external object that supposedly produces them. Philosophers attempted to bridge this gap through causal reasoning. They argued that our sensations must have external causes, that the regular patterns in our experience require independent objects producing them. But Hume's analysis of causation undermines this argument. We can only infer causes from effects when we have experienced the constant conjunction of both. We have experience of impressions, but no experience of the supposed external objects causing them. We cannot observe the connection between impressions and external objects because we never perceive both terms of the relation. Think about the circularity of trying to prove the external world's existence. Any argument must start from premises we know through experience. But all we experience are our own impressions. To argue from impressions to external objects requires assuming that impressions represent external reality, but this assumption is precisely what we are trying to prove. We cannot use impressions as evidence for external objects without first assuming the very connection we are attempting to establish. Yet we all believe in the external world. This belief is universal, involuntary, and practically ineliminable. Even the skeptical philosopher who demonstrates that this belief cannot be rationally justified finds themselves assuming external objects the moment they stop philosophizing. We cannot help believing that objects exist when unperceived, that the world has an existence independent of our experience, that our perceptions represent a reality beyond themselves. Hume's explanation for this natural belief appeals to principles of the imagination. When we experience a sequence of similar impressions, seeing the same table on different occasions, the imagination creates the fiction of a continuously existing object underlying these separate experiences. The similarity of the impressions leads imagination to suppose identity, to treat what are actually different impressions as perceptions of the same enduring thing. This is not a rational inference, but a psychological tendency, a habit of mind that constructs continuity from similarity. The imagination also smooths over interruptions in perception. When you look away from the table and then look back, you don't experience the table continuously existing through the interval. You have one set of impressions, then a gap, then another set, but imagination fills this gap. Supposing the table existed throughout even when unperceived. This construction gives us the belief in continued existence, that objects persist when we're not observing them. Consider also the belief in distinct existence, that objects exist external to and independent of our minds. This belief, Hume suggests, arises from a confusion between impressions and objects. We naturally treat our impressions as if they were the objects themselves, as if what we perceive exists outside us in just the way we perceive it. The vividness and involuntariness of sense impressions makes them seem external, distinct from our will and thought. We project these impressions outward, treating them as independent objects rather than as states of our own consciousness. But this natural belief involves contradictions that become apparent on reflection. The same object appears different from different perspectives. A table looks round from above, elliptical from an angle. If we identify the object with our impression, it must be both round and elliptical, which is impossible. If we distinguish object from impression, we lose direct access to the object and face the skeptical problems already discussed. The natural belief cannot be made philosophically coherent, yet we cannot abandon it. Think about what this reveals about the relationship between reason and nature. Reason, through philosophical analysis, demonstrates that belief in the external world lacks justification. Nature, through psychological mechanisms of imagination and habit, produces this belief anyway and makes it practically unavoidable. Philosophy and nature conflict, and nature always wins. We cannot reason ourselves into consistent skepticism about the external world because our psychological constitution overrides philosophical doubts. Hume sees this as evidence for the limits of reason's authority. Reason can critique beliefs, reveal their lack of justification, expose contradictions in how we understand them. But reason cannot eliminate natural beliefs that serve essential functions for human life. Belief in the external world allows us to navigate reality successfully, to learn from experience, to coordinate action with others. Its practical utility, not its rational justification, explains its persistence. The philosopher who recognizes this situation adopts a kind of double consciousness. In the study, analyzing the foundations of belief, they acknowledge that the external world's existence cannot be proven and that the concept involves contradictions. But in ordinary life, they believe in the external world as naturally and inevitably as anyone else, allowing nature to override philosophical doubts. This is not intellectual dishonesty, but recognition that human nature makes certain beliefs unavoidable, regardless of their philosophical status. What remains is a naturalistic account of a belief traditionally thought to require philosophical defense. We don't believe in the external world because arguments prove its existence. We believe because imagination constructs continuity from similarity, because habit leads us to expect regular patterns to continue, because the vividness of sensation makes us treat impressions as external objects. The belief is natural but not rational, universal but not justified, essential for life but philosophically problematic. And in this tension between natural belief and rational critique, we find another instance of Hume's fundamental insight. Nature governs human thought more powerfully than reason, and perhaps this is as it should be, since reason alone could never produce the beliefs necessary for living in the world. Justice as an artificial virtue. There is a distinction within morality that reveals something fundamental about human social life. Some virtues are natural: kindness, generosity, benevolence, arising spontaneously from human sentiment without need for social convention. But other virtues are artificial, arising not from natural sentiment but from human conventions designed to solve coordination problems. Justice is the paradigmatic artificial virtue, and understanding its artificial character illuminates the relationship between natural human psychology and the requirements of social living. Natural virtues produce immediate approbation through the sentiments they evoke. When you witness kindness, you feel immediate approval arising from sympathy with the beneficiary's pleasure. When you observe cruelty, you feel immediate disapproval arising from sympathetic pain. No complex reasoning or convention is needed. The moral sentiment arises directly from natural human emotional responses. Natural virtues are those whose practice directly produces agreeable sentiments in observers. But justice works differently. Consider a particular act of justice, returning borrowed money when you are desperately poor and the lender is wealthy. This individual act might produce more harm than good in this particular case. The poor person suffers greatly from the loss, while the rich person barely notices the gain. Yet we judge the act just and praiseworthy. Why? Not because this particular act produces good consequences or agreeable sentiments, but because adherence to rules of justice produces beneficial consequences for society as a whole. Think about why justice requires rules and conventions. Humans have limited benevolence. We naturally care more about ourselves and those close to us than about strangers. We also face scarcity. There are not enough resources for everyone to have everything they want, and external goods like property can be transferred from one person to another. These conditions create inevitable conflicts. Without rules governing property and mutual obligations, society would collapse into chaos as everyone pursued their own advantage without restraint. Justice arises as the solution to this problem. Humans recognize that everyone benefits if certain rules are established and generally followed, rules about property rights, promise-keeping, mutual aid in certain circumstances. These rules are not natural in the sense of arising spontaneously from sentiment. They are artificial, created through convention, sustained through enforcement and mutual expectation. We agree, implicitly or explicitly, to follow these rules because we all benefit from their general observance. The interesting feature of artificial virtues is that their value lies in the system they constitute rather than in individual acts considered separately. Any single act of justice might produce bad consequences in its particular circumstances, But the system of justice, the general adherence to rules even when breaking them, would be beneficial in particular cases, produces tremendous social benefits. Property becomes secure, cooperation becomes possible, complex social coordination emerges. We approve of just acts, not because they individually produce good, but because they support a valuable system. Consider the role of sympathy in our approval of justice. We don't sympathize directly with the particular consequences of individual just acts, which might be minimal or even negative. We sympathize with the general interests of society in maintaining the system of justice. Through imagination, we step back from particular cases and consider the benefits that general adherence to rules of justice provides to everyone. This broad sympathy with social utility, not narrow sympathy with particular effects, generates our moral approval of justice. This reveals something important about moral sentiment. It is not purely immediate and unreflective. It involves imaginative extension, the capacity to take up general points of view, sympathy with systemic consequences rather than just direct effects. Natural virtues operate through simple, direct sympathy. Artificial virtues require more sophisticated moral cognition, the ability to see beyond particular cases to the value of general rules and systems. Hume identifies several specific rules of justice. The stability of possession, some system determining who owns what and protecting those ownership claims. The transference of property by consent, allowing people to exchange goods through agreement. The performance of promises, creating obligations through voluntary commitment that bind future conduct. These rules constitute the basic framework of justice, making social cooperation possible despite limited benevolence and competition for scarce resources. But why call these virtues artificial rather than simply conventional? Hume wants to emphasize that they do not flow directly from human nature in the way benevolence does. We are not naturally inclined to respect property rights when violating them would benefit us. We are not naturally moved to keep promises when breaking them would be advantageous. Justice requires construction, the establishment of conventions that constrain natural inclinations for the sake of social benefits that those inclinations would not spontaneously produce. Yet artificial does not mean arbitrary. The rules of justice are not random or purely optional. They arise from real problems that any human society must solve. The specific rules vary across cultures. Different societies organize property differently, have different conventions about promises and obligations. But every successful society develops some system of justice addressing these fundamental problems. The artificial is still natural in the sense of being a natural response to universal features of the human condition. Think about the implications for political philosophy. Justice is not discovered through reason, revealing natural law. It is created through convention-solving coordination problems, but it is also not purely imposed by power or accident. It arises from human recognition of mutual benefit and cooperation, sustained by sentiments of approval and disapproval that reflect sympathy with social utility. Justice occupies a middle ground between the purely natural and the purely arbitrary, showing how human conventions can be both constructed and necessary, both artificial and grounded in human nature. The distinction between natural and artificial virtues reveals that morality has multiple sources. Some moral responses flow directly from natural sentiment, the immediate sympathy that makes cruelty wrong and kindness right. Other moral judgments depend on recognition of systemic benefits, the reflective appreciation that makes justice valuable even when particular just acts produce harm. Both natural sentiment and conventional agreement play essential roles in moral life, and understanding the relationship between them illuminates how morality can be both natural and social, both rooted in human psychology and requiring human construction. Property and convention. There is a question that seems simple but conceals profound complexity. What makes something yours rather than mine? Property feels natural, almost self-evident. This is my house. That is your car. These are her books. Yet when we examine the foundations of property, we discover not a natural relationship, but an elaborate conventional system, a human invention designed to solve practical problems arising from scarcity and limited benevolence. Hume's analysis of property reveals how much of what seems natural is actually artificial, constructed through social agreement for mutual benefit. In a state of nature, before social conventions, nothing is anyone's property in any meaningful sense. Objects exist, people can use and possess them temporarily, but there are no stable ownership claims, no rights that constrain others' actions regarding external goods. If I am stronger, I can take what you hold. If you are clever, you can take what I have left unguarded. Without convention, possession is temporary and precarious, maintained only through continuous force or vigilance. This state produces obvious problems. No one will invest labor in improving goods if others can simply take them. No one will save for the future if others will consume their savings. Cooperation becomes impossible when everyone fears that contributions will be taken by others without reciprocal return. The advantages of stable ownership are clear to everyone, yet no individual can establish stability alone. This is a coordination problem requiring collective solution. Property emerges as that solution. People recognize mutual advantage in establishing and respecting ownership claims. They agree, through convention rather than explicit contract, to respect certain rules. You will not take what is mine, I will not take what is yours, and we will both benefit from this mutual restraint. The agreement need not be formal or explicit. It can arise gradually through custom and expectation, each person adjusting their behavior in response to others' patterns until a stable system of mutual respect for possession emerges. Think about what makes this convention stable. Each person has an incentive to violate it when doing so would benefit them, to take what belongs to another when they can do so without consequence. Yet each person also benefits from others' compliance and loses if the system breaks down. The convention succeeds when people recognize that universal compliance produces better outcomes than universal violation, and when mechanisms exist to enforce compliance or punish defection. But how do we determine what belongs to whom? Hume identifies several principles that guide property assignment. First, occupancy. The first person to take possession of an unclaimed good has a privileged claim to it. Long possession, continued holding of something over time, strengthens claims. Accession, the natural products of what you own become yours, the fruit of your tree, the offspring of your animal. These principles are not natural laws but conventions that humans find convenient for settling ownership questions without constant dispute. Consider also the role of labor in property claims. When you mix your labor with an object, cultivating land, building a structure, crafting an artifact, this creates a particularly strong sense of ownership. Partly this is because labor transforms the object, making it more valuable or useful. Partly it is because taking the product of someone's labor feels like taking a piece of their life, the time and effort they invested. The convention recognizing labor as creating property claims reflects these psychological associations. Yet property rules vary significantly across societies. Different cultures assign ownership differently, recognize different grounds for claims, distribute resources through different principles. Some societies emphasize communal ownership, others individual. Some transfer property through inheritance to eldest sons, others divide equally among children, others follow different patterns entirely. This variation shows that property is conventional, taking different forms in different contexts, shaped by circumstances and cultural values. But this does not make property arbitrary. Whatever specific rules a society adopts, it must address the same fundamental problems, determining stable ownership, enabling transfers through exchange or gift, creating expectations that allow planning and cooperation. The universal problems generate universal needs that property conventions satisfy, even as the specific conventions vary. Property is artificial but not optional, conventional but not random. Think about what happens when property rules are violated. We feel moral disapproval. not merely because the victim suffers, but because violation threatens the entire system that benefits everyone. When someone steals, they are not just taking from one person but undermining the conventions that make social cooperation possible. Our moral reaction reflects sympathetic concern for the system's preservation, recognition that property rules must be generally respected if society is to function. Hume also addresses the question of justice in property distribution. Should property be distributed equally? Should it be concentrated? Should distribution reward merit or need? He suggests that perfect equality, while superficially attractive, would be impossible to maintain and might reduce incentives for productive labor. Unequal distribution, while generating some resentment, provides motivation for effort and allows property to flow to those who value it most. The question admits of no simple answer, but depends on balancing multiple considerations. What matters most for Hume is not the specific distribution, but the stability of whatever distribution exists. Clear and enforced property rules, whatever their content, provide greater benefits than unstable or contested rules. People can plan, invest, cooperate when they know what is theirs, and can trust that others will respect these claims. The security provided by stable convention outweighs advantages of any particular distribution pattern. Property illuminates a general feature of human social life. Much that seems natural, ownership, rights, obligations, is actually conventional, created through human agreement to solve coordination problems. Yet these conventions are not arbitrary impositions, but responses to real features of the human condition. They arise from universal problems and are sustained by recognition of mutual benefit, approved through sentiments that reflect sympathy with social utility. The artificial can be necessary, the conventional can be unavoidable, and understanding this reveals how human societies construct the frameworks that make cooperative life possible. The origin of government. There is a paradox at the heart of political authority. Government claims the right to command obedience, to enforce laws, even to punish those who resist. Yet government is created by ordinary people who possess no natural authority over others. How does the mere aggregation of individuals without authority generate an institution with legitimate power to govern? Hume addresses this question by examining why government arises and how it acquires the authority necessary for maintaining social order. Government becomes necessary because justice alone proves insufficient for large-scale cooperation. In small groups where everyone knows everyone else, where reputation matters and violations are immediately apparent, informal conventions can maintain cooperation. People follow rules of justice because they recognize mutual benefit and because violations would damage their standing in the community. But as societies grow larger, these informal mechanisms break down. Think about the problems that arise in large societies. Many interactions are between strangers who will never meet again, eliminating reputational concerns that enforce cooperation in small groups. Violations of justice can be hidden or their perpetrators unknown, making informal punishment impossible. The benefits of cooperation are diffuse and distant, while temptations to defect are immediate and concrete. Without formal enforcement mechanisms, each person has reason to violate rules when doing so benefits them, and the system of justice collapses. Government solves these problems by creating institutions with power to enforce rules and punish violations. Magistrates observe conduct and punish infractions. Laws specify obligations clearly and publicly. Police power makes violations costly and risky. These mechanisms change individual incentives, making compliance with justice more attractive than defection, even in contexts where informal enforcement would fail. Government uses concentrated power to maintain the system of justice that benefits everyone but that individuals would undermine in pursuit of narrow self-interest. But why do people obey government? Not from natural sentiment. We have no instinctive inclination to submit to political authority. Hume identifies two sources of political obligation. First, interest. We recognize that we benefit from the order government maintains, that life would be worse in its absence, that obedience to law serves our long-term advantage, even when it conflicts with immediate desires. Second, custom. Long-established governments acquire authority through familiarity and habit, through the psychological mechanism that makes us accept what has long existed without questioning its legitimacy. Consider how government initially emerges, perhaps through voluntary agreement, when people explicitly recognize the need for enforcement institutions, perhaps through gradual development as informal leaders gain increasing authority to settle disputes and coordinate action, perhaps through conquest when foreign powers impose order on conquered territories. The origin varies, but in all cases government becomes established and accepted when people recognize it as serving important functions that informal cooperation cannot accomplish. Yet government poses its own problems. Who guards the guardians? What prevents those with power from using it for private advantage rather than public good? Government creates a new coordination problem, ensuring that those with authority use it to maintain justice rather than to exploit subjects. Hume recognizes this problem but sees no perfect solution, only mechanisms that imperfectly constrain governmental power. One mechanism is interest. Rulers recognize that their position depends on maintaining public support, that excessive exploitation will provoke resistance or rebellion, that their own long-term interests align with governing tolerably well. Another is opinion. Subjects' willingness to obey depends on believing government is legitimate and serves their interests, so rulers must cultivate this belief through propaganda and through actually providing benefits that justify their authority. A third is institutional structure, dividing power among multiple officials, creating systems of checks and balances, establishing procedures that make abuse more difficult. Think about the relationship between force and opinion in maintaining government. Force alone cannot sustain rule. No government has sufficient military power to compel universal obedience if the entire population actively resists. Government ultimately rests on opinion, on subjects' belief that they should obey, that government is legitimate, that resistance would be wrong or futile. But opinion is shaped partly by force. The credible threat of punishment for disobedience influences beliefs about whether compliance is necessary. Hume also addresses the question of legitimate resistance to government. When does tyranny become so severe that subjects are justified in rebelling? He offers no simple formula, but suggests that resistance is justified when government fails so badly in its essential functions that subjects would be better off without it than under it. This is a prudential calculation, not an absolute right. People must weigh the evils of tyranny against the chaos of rebellion, recognizing that destroying established government creates risks of worse outcomes. The origin and authority of government illuminate the conventional rather than natural basis of political obligation. We obey not because nature or reason dictates obedience, but because convention establishes institutions that serve functions necessary for social cooperation. Political authority is artificial, created by humans to solve coordination problems that informal mechanisms cannot address. Yet this artificiality does not make government optional or its authority purely arbitrary. It remains necessary and acquires legitimacy through performing essential social functions. What remains is a naturalistic account of political life, one that explains government through human psychology and social needs rather than through divine right, natural law, or social contract theory. Government arises from practical necessities, gains authority through custom and interest, and is constrained by the need to maintain opinions supporting its legitimacy. Politics is human construction all the way down, responding to real problems with institutions that prove useful, even if imperfect, conventional, even if unavoidable. Beauty and the standard of taste. There is a realm of judgment that seems both subjective and objective, where personal responses appear to matter, yet standards seem to exist. When you call a painting beautiful or a poem sublime, are you expressing merely personal preference, or are you making a claim that could be right or wrong? Hume examines aesthetic judgment and discovers a complex relationship between individual sentiment and general standards, between the purely personal and the genuinely universal in our responses to beauty and art. Beauty, Hume insists, is not a quality in objects themselves. When you perceive something as beautiful, You are not detecting an objective property like color or shape. Beauty exists, not in the mind-independent world, but in the sentiment of the observer. To call something beautiful is to report that it produces certain pleasant feelings in you, feelings of aesthetic approval. Different objects produce these feelings in different people, and even the same object might produce beauty feelings in one person while leaving another unmoved. This seems to make aesthetic judgment purely subjective, merely a matter of personal taste with no right or wrong answers. If beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and beholders differ, then disputes about beauty would be pointless. Your taste is what it is, mine is what it is, and neither can be correct or incorrect. Yet this radical subjectivism conflicts with our actual aesthetic practices. We do argue about aesthetic merit. We do claim that some judgments are better than others. We do believe that experts in art have more reliable taste than novices. Think about how we actually respond to aesthetic disagreements. If someone claims that a crude scribble is artistically equal to a Rembrandt painting, we don't simply accept this as their taste. We think they're wrong, that they've failed to perceive genuine aesthetic qualities, that their judgment reveals deficiency rather than mere difference. This response assumes standards of taste exist, that aesthetic judgments can be better or worse, even if they ultimately rest on sentiment rather than reason. Hume proposes that while beauty is subjective, there exists a standard of taste grounded in the responses of qualified judges. These judges possess several characteristics: delicate sensibility, capable of perceiving subtle aesthetic qualities, extensive practice developing their discriminatory abilities, freedom from prejudice that might distort response, comparative knowledge of many works allowing informed judgment, and good sense that prevents mere whimsy or caprice from influencing evaluation. Such ideal critics, while rare, provide a standard for aesthetic judgment. The standard emerges from general agreement among qualified judges. When people with developed taste, extensive experience, and refined sensibility agree that something is beautiful, this constitutes objective aesthetic merit as far as such a thing can exist. The standard is not purely subjective because it reflects structured responses of properly functioning aesthetic sensibility, but it is not purely objective either because it ultimately grounds in sentiment rather than in properties of the objects themselves. Consider why certain features regularly produce aesthetic pleasure across qualified observers. Proportion, harmony, unity and variety, skillful execution, emotional depth. These qualities reliably evoke positive aesthetic response because of regularities in human psychology. We are built to find certain patterns pleasing, certain relationships harmonious, certain expressions moving. These regularities in response create something like objective aesthetic value, even though beauty ultimately consists in sentiment. But significant variation remains. Different cultures develop different aesthetic traditions, valuing different qualities and producing different standards. Even within a culture, individuals differ in their responses. What moves one person deeply might leave another cold. Hume acknowledges these variations while insisting they don't entirely eliminate standards. Core aesthetic values remain relatively stable across cultures and individuals, even as specific applications and preferences vary. Think about the role of education in aesthetic judgment. We can improve our taste through exposure, study, comparison, reflection. This suggests aesthetic judgment involves skill and knowledge, not merely raw sentiment. The qualified judge has learned to perceive subtle qualities that novices miss, to appreciate excellences that require understanding to recognize, to distinguish genuine merit from superficial appeal. Aesthetic education shapes sentiment, refining natural responses into more discriminating judgments. Hume also notes that some aesthetic variations are harmless and should be accepted. Personal associations can make certain works especially meaningful to particular individuals without implying that everyone should share this response. Cultural differences can generate distinct aesthetic traditions, each valid within its context. The standard of taste doesn't require universal agreement on every particular, but rather convergence among qualified judges on core excellences and defects. The pleasure beauty produces differs from other pleasures. It is disinterested, not tied to possessing the object or satisfying desire, but arising from contemplation alone. It is universal, tending to produce agreement among qualified observers rather than purely idiosyncratic. It is necessary, seeming to flow from the object's qualities rather than from arbitrary preference. These features distinguish aesthetic pleasure from mere sensory gratification or personal inclination. Consider how this account makes sense of critical discourse. When critics debate artistic merit, they are not merely expressing preferences but arguing about how qualified observers should respond. They point to features of works that ground aesthetic judgment, compositional choices, technical execution, emotional power, thematic depth. While these features produce their effects through sentiment, their presence or absence can be identified and discussed, making rational aesthetic discourse possible. What remains is a middle path between radical subjectivism and rigid objectivism. Beauty is sentiment-dependent, existing only in response rather than in objects themselves. Yet standards exist because human nature produces regular patterns in aesthetic response, because experience and education refine judgment, because qualified observers converge in their evaluations. Aesthetic judgment is neither purely subjective nor purely objective, but intersubjective, grounded in regularities of human response while allowing for variation and development. And in this balanced account, Hume shows how sentiment can be structured enough to support standards while remaining genuine sentiment rather than disguised reasoning, how taste can be cultivated without ceasing to be taste, how aesthetic judgment can matter, even though it ultimately reflects feeling rather than fact. Religion within the bounds of nature. There is a topic that Hume approaches with particular caution, knowing his conclusions will provoke controversy and possibly danger. Religion pervades his society, shapes institutions, influences thought at every level. Yet when he applies his empiricist method to religious belief, examining what experience actually teaches about the divine, the results challenge traditional theology at its foundations. Hume does not attack religion directly, but shows that its claims cannot be established through reason or experience, that religious belief rests on psychological foundations rather than rational proof. We have already examined Hume's critique of the design argument, the attempt to infer God's existence from apparent order in nature, but he addresses religion from multiple angles, always asking what experience can actually justify versus what human psychology leads us to believe. When people claim knowledge of God's attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, eternity, Hume asks from what impressions are these ideas derived, and the honest answer must be from none. We have no experience of infinite power, unlimited knowledge, perfect goodness, or eternal existence. This does not prove God does not exist. It shows that claims to know God's nature through reason or experience cannot be sustained. Whatever exists beyond experience remains unknown to us, and God, if existing, would be precisely such a transcendent being. The modest conclusion is not atheism, but agnosticism, acknowledgement that we simply lack the evidence to determine religious truth. Think about how religious belief actually arises in human psychology. Hume suggests it springs not from philosophical reflection, but from natural tendencies. We anthropomorphize, attributing human-like minds to natural forces. We seek explanations for mysterious phenomena, inventing invisible agents to account for what we don't understand. We fear the unknown and create protective deities. We experience unusual mental states, visions, intuitions, ecstasies, and interpret them as divine communication. Religion emerges from these psychological mechanisms operating on experiences that could be explained naturalistically. The universal presence of religion across cultures does not prove religious claims true. It proves only that human psychology reliably produces religious belief under certain conditions. Different cultures develop different religions with incompatible doctrines. They cannot all be true, yet all arise from similar psychological sources. This suggests that religion tells us more about human nature than about transcendent reality, that religious belief reflects our needs and fears rather than genuine knowledge of the divine. Hume examines particular religious doctrines with skeptical scrutiny. Miracles supposedly prove religious truth, but we have seen his analysis showing that testimony can never make a miracle probable. Prophecies supposedly demonstrate divine inspiration, but alleged prophecies are typically vague, subject to multiple interpretations, or recorded after the events they supposedly predicted. Religious experiences supposedly provide direct knowledge of God, but such experiences vary dramatically across traditions and could be explained as psychological phenomena rather than genuine divine encounters. Consider the problem of evil for religious belief. If God is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, why does the world contain so much suffering? Traditional theology struggles to reconcile divine perfection with observable imperfection in creation. Hume suggests that this problem arises from trying to infer God's attributes from the world. If we look at the world honestly, without presupposing divine perfection, we find a mixture of good and evil, pleasure and pain, order and chaos. This mixed evidence supports at most a hypothesis of a limited, imperfect, or indifferent creator, not the perfect God of traditional monotheism. Think about the diversity of religious opinions, even within a single tradition. Theologians disagree profoundly about God's nature, the afterlife's character, the requirements for salvation, the proper interpretation of Scripture. If religious truth were accessible through reason or experience, we would expect convergence as inquiry progresses. Instead, we find proliferating disagreement, suggesting that religious belief stems from sources other than evidence from cultural tradition, psychological need, social pressure, or subjective experience that cannot be verified or shared. Hume also questions the moral foundations often attributed to religion. People claim that morality requires religious belief, that without God commanding good and forbidding evil, moral obligation would collapse. But Hume's sentimentalist ethics grounds morality in human nature rather than divine command. We approve of benevolence and disapprove of cruelty because of natural sentiments, not because God orders or forbids these attitudes. Morality is autonomous from religion, rooted in sympathetic responses that would persist even if religious belief disappeared. Moreover, history shows that religious belief often produces immoral behavior. People commit atrocities believing they serve divine will. Religious differences provoke persecution and violence. Doctrines of eternal punishment create fear that distorts moral motivation. Religious enthusiasm leads to fanaticism that overrides ordinary moral sentiment. If religion were the foundation of morality, we would expect religious people to be consistently more moral than the irreligious, but observation reveals no such pattern. The psychological explanation for religious belief suggests it arises from several sources. Fear in the face of uncertain and dangerous existence leads people to imagine powerful beings who might protect or harm them. Hope for meaning in what seems chaotic prompts belief in purposeful design. Desire for justice when the world distributes goods unfairly generates belief in an afterlife where accounts are balanced. Experiences of awe or wonder produce feelings interpreted as divine presence. None of these sources provides evidence for religious claims, but all explain why humans naturally form religious beliefs. Hume distinguishes between philosophical religion and popular religion. Philosophical religion attempts to establish religious truth through reason and argument. But we have seen that these arguments fail. The design argument is weak. Miracles lack sufficient evidence. Moral arguments presuppose what they try to prove. Popular religion, by contrast, does not depend on argument but on custom, emotion, and social practice. It provides comfort, community, and meaning rather than knowledge. This religion might serve valuable psychological and social functions without making true claims about transcendent reality. Consider also Hume's suggestion that the best religion, if we must have religion, is a simple, minimal theism that acknowledges mystery rather than claiming detailed knowledge of the divine. This philosophical religion would recognize the limits of human understanding, resist dogmatic claims about God's nature, avoid persecution of those with different views, and separate religious belief from moral obligation. Such a modest religion would cause less harm while retaining whatever legitimate functions religion serves. But even this minimal theism faces Hume's skeptical challenges. We have no clear idea of God, no impression from which such an idea could be derived. The inference from world to creator is weak. The attributes traditionally assigned to God lack evidential support. Perhaps the most honest position is simply to acknowledge ignorance, to recognize that if transcendent reality exists, it remains beyond our epistemic reach, knowable neither through reason nor through experience. Hume's religious skepticism does not make him an enemy of religion per se. He recognizes that religious belief is natural to humans, that it serves psychological needs, that attempting to eliminate it might be both impossible and unwise. But he insists on intellectual honesty about religion's epistemic status. Religious beliefs are not knowledge but faith, not discoveries about transcendent reality, but projections of human hopes and fears. And recognizing this distinction allows us to be modest in our claims, tolerant of disagreement, and resistant to the harms that arise when people treat their religious beliefs as certain truths justifying coercion or persecution. What remains is a thoroughly naturalistic account of religion, one that explains its origins, functions, and persistence through human psychology rather than through divine revelation. Religion tells us much about human nature, little about transcendent reality. And this conclusion, however unwelcome to traditional believers, follows from applying consistently the empiricist method that Hume applies to all other domains of inquiry. The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. There is a work that Hume considered so controversial he withheld it from publication during his lifetime, arranging for it to appear only after his death. The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion presents three characters debating the rational foundations of religious belief, examining whether reason can establish God's existence or determine divine attributes. Through this dialogue format, Hume explores religious questions from multiple perspectives while maintaining plausible deniability about his own views, allowing ideas to clash without directly endorsing the most skeptical conclusions. The three speakers represent different approaches to natural religion, the attempt to know God through reason and observation rather than revelation. Cleanthes defends the argument from design, claiming that nature's order proves an intelligent designer. Demea argues for a priori proofs of God's existence and emphasizes the mysteriousness of divine nature. Philo, the skeptical voice, systematically dismantles both approaches while raising profound difficulties for any attempt to know God through natural means. Through Philo, Hume presents objections we have already encountered but develops them with particular force. The analogy between human artifacts and the universe is weak. The universe is unique, and we have no experience of universe-making against which to judge whether intelligence is required. Even if the argument worked, it would prove at most a finite, imperfect designer, not the infinite perfect God of traditional theism. The evidence of nature is mixed, revealing as much disorder and evil as order and good, supporting no confident inference to a benevolent creator. Think about how the dialogue format serves Hume's purposes. He can present skeptical arguments through Philo without directly endorsing them. He can show Cleanthes' design argument demolished without claiming personal responsibility for the demolition. He can explore dangerous ideas while maintaining the fiction that he is merely reporting a philosophical conversation. This literary strategy protects him from accusations of atheism or impiety, while allowing full airing of arguments that challenge religious orthodoxy. Philo raises particularly powerful objections to inferring God's moral attributes from observation of the world. If we judge God's character by examining creation, we must conclude that God is indifferent to suffering, limited in power, or possibly malevolent. The world contains immense pain, diseases, natural disasters, predation, death, Traditional theodicy attempts to reconcile this evil with divine goodness by claiming evil serves greater purposes or results from human free will. But Philo shows these explanations fail to account for the quantity and distribution of suffering we observe. Consider the four circumstances that produce human misery, which Philo systematically analyzes. First, pain is not precisely calibrated to its useful function. We suffer far more than needed to avoid danger. Second, nature operates through general laws rather than particular providence, producing collateral harm alongside whatever benefits these laws provide. Third, nature is parsimonious with capacities, giving creatures barely enough to survive rather than abundance. Fourth, the workmanship of nature is imprecise, producing countless defects and malfunctions. None of this suggests a perfectly good omnipotent creator. The dialogue also examines alternative hypotheses to intelligent design. Perhaps the universe resulted from random material motion operating over infinite time, eventually producing stable configurations through blind chance. Perhaps it arose through something analogous to vegetative growth or generation rather than conscious planning. Perhaps multiple deities with conflicting purposes created different aspects of reality. Perhaps an incompetent or junior deity practicing their craft produced our imperfect world. All these hypotheses, while speculative, seem as compatible with observable evidence as the hypothesis of a perfect creator. Think about what this proliferation of alternatives reveals. The design argument depends on the claim that intelligent creation is the only or best explanation for observed order. But once we consider other possibilities, natural processes, imperfect designers, multiple creators, the inference to one perfect God loses its force. The evidence underdetermines the conclusion, allowing multiple incompatible hypotheses to account for the same observations. Demia's a priori arguments fare no better under examination. He attempts to prove God's existence through pure reason, arguing that God must exist as a necessary being. But Philo shows that existence cannot be necessary in the logical sense. Whatever we can conceive existing, we can also conceive not existing. The concept of necessary existence is confused, attempting to derive matters of fact from relations of ideas, violating the distinction Hume elsewhere insists upon. A priori proofs of God's existence are as impossible as a priori proofs of any other existential claim. The dialogue's conclusion remains deliberately ambiguous. Cleanthes' arguments are devastated, but not formally withdrawn. Philo makes concessions to natural piety while having demolished every rational foundation for it. The narrative voice suggests that Cleanthes' position emerges victorious, but attentive readers recognize that Philo's skeptical arguments have actually carried the day. This ambiguity allows Hume to present devastating critiques while technically maintaining that the dialogue does not definitively endorse skepticism. What emerges from the dialogues is the impossibility of natural theology, of knowing God through reason and observation. All attempts to infer divine existence or attributes from experience fail. The best we can achieve is a vague, indeterminate belief in some ultimate cause, but this minimal theism bears little resemblance to the rich doctrines of traditional religion. And even this minimal belief rests on questionable inference, perhaps reflecting more about human psychology than about transcendent reality. The work remains one of the most powerful examinations of religion's rational foundations ever written. Its arguments continue to challenge anyone who claims that reason can establish religious truth. And its careful, indirect presentation shows Hume's awareness that some truths are dangerous to express directly, requiring literary strategies that allow ideas to circulate while protecting their author from the consequences of their implications. Hume's fork: relations of ideas and matters of fact. There is a distinction that cuts through all human reasoning, dividing everything we can think about into two fundamental categories. Hume identifies this division with particular clarity, creating what later philosophers call Hume's fork, a classification that separates relations of ideas from matters of fact, showing that these two kinds of knowledge differ fundamentally in their source, their certainty, and their limitations. Understanding this fork illuminates why some questions admit of certain answers, while others can never be conclusively resolved. Relations of ideas concern the logical connections among concepts themselves, independent of whether anything corresponding to those concepts exists in reality. Mathematics and logic exemplify this category. When you know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or that all bachelors are unmarried, or that if A is larger than B and B is larger than C, then A must be larger than C, you know something whose truth depends only on the meanings of the terms involved. These propositions can be known with certainty because they merely make explicit what is already implicit in the concepts. The key feature of relations of ideas is that their denial involves contradiction. Try to conceive of 2 plus 2 equaling 5. You find yourself asserting something logically impossible, not merely false but incoherent. Try to imagine a married bachelor. You are attempting to combine concepts that exclude each other by definition. Relations of ideas have this character. They are necessarily true, knowable through reason alone, admitting of no exceptions, but they purchase certainty by not making substantive claims about what exists. Think about what this means for mathematical and logical knowledge. We can be absolutely certain that mathematical truths are true because they do not depend on how the world happens to be. No observation could refute the claim that triangles have 3 sides, because this follows from what we mean by triangle. No experience could show that logical contradictions are true, because contradictions are ruled out by the very structure of coherent thought. Relations of ideas are secure precisely because they are empty of existential content. Matters of fact, by contrast, concern what actually exists and what actually happens in the world. The claim that the sun rose this morning, that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, that human beings exist, that fire burns, all these are matters of fact. Their truth depends not merely on meanings, but on how reality actually is. And crucially, their denial involves no logical contradiction. We can coherently conceive of the sun not rising, of water boiling at different temperatures, of a world without humans, of fire that freezes rather than burns. This conceivability reveals something fundamental. Matters of fact can never be known with absolute certainty. Since their denial involves no contradiction, since we can imagine them being otherwise, we can never be completely sure that our beliefs about them are true. All knowledge of matters of fact depends on experience, and experience can never provide the kind of certainty that logic provides. Even our most confident beliefs about the world, that the future will resemble the past, that objects exist when unperceived, rest on foundations that experience cannot secure. Consider what this division implies for different domains of inquiry. Mathematics and formal logic can achieve certainty, but do not tell us about the actual world. Science, history, and everyday observation tell us about the actual world, but cannot achieve certainty. Metaphysics often attempts to make claims about existence with the certainty appropriate to logic, but this attempt must fail because existential claims are always matters of fact, always conceivably false, always dependent on experience that cannot provide certainty. Hume's fork helps diagnose confusion in philosophy. When metaphysicians claim to know with certainty that substances exist, that causes necessarily produce effects, that the soul is immortal, they are attempting to treat matters of fact as relations of ideas. They try to derive existential conclusions from pure reason, to establish what exists through logical argument alone, but this cannot work. Existence claims, being matters of fact, require empirical justification that can never achieve the certainty that rationalist metaphysics seeks. Think about how this affects the status of causal reasoning. When we infer effects from causes, we are making claims about matters of fact. We cannot know with certainty that fire will burn or that bread will nourish because these claims about causal connections are not relations of ideas. Their denial involves no logical contradiction. We can coherently imagine fire that freezes or bread that poisons. Our confidence in these causal beliefs comes from repeated experience, not from logical necessity. They are psychologically irresistible, but rationally unjustifiable. The distinction also reveals limitations in what questions philosophy can definitively answer. Questions about relations of ideas can be answered with certainty through analysis and deduction. Questions about observable matters of fact can be answered with practical certainty through repeated experience. But questions about unobservable matters of fact, about transcendent reality, ultimate causes, metaphysical necessity, admit of no certain answers because they concern matters of fact beyond experience's reach. Hume's fork influences how we should approach inquiry in different domains. In mathematics and logic, we can seek demonstrative proof and achieve certainty. In empirical science, we should seek evidence through observation and remain open to revision. In metaphysics, we should recognize that most traditional questions concern matters of fact beyond possible experience, making them effectively unanswerable and perhaps meaningless. The fork disciplines thought, directing inquiry toward tractable questions while exposing pretensions to knowledge we cannot possess. Later philosophers like Kant and the logical positivists developed this distinction in different directions. Kant distinguishes analytic from synthetic judgments, exploring whether synthetic a priori knowledge, knowledge that is both substantive and necessary, is possible. Logical positivists radicalize Hume's empiricism, claiming that statements neither analytically true nor empirically verifiable are meaningless. But Hume's original insight remains foundational. Necessity and certainty are available only where claims depend on meanings rather than facts, and all substantive knowledge of reality remains forever provisional. What Hume's fork ultimately provides is intellectual humility about what we can know and how we can know it. It shows why some certainty is possible in formal domains, while all claims about existence remain uncertain. It explains why metaphysical disputes resist resolution. They concern matters of fact treated as relations of ideas. It reveals that much traditional philosophy attempts the impossible, seeking certainty about existence through reason alone. And in making these distinctions clear, it redirects philosophy toward more modest but more achievable goals. The treatise that fell stillborn from the press. There is a work of philosophy so ambitious, it attempts nothing less than a complete science of human nature, a systematic examination of understanding, passions, and morals, grounded in observation and experiment. David Hume completed this masterwork in his 20s, confident it would revolutionize philosophy as Newton had revolutionized physics. He published it anonymously in 1739 and 1740, awaiting the acclaim he believed it deserved. Instead, it met with near-universal indifference. In Hume's later, bitter words, it fell dead-born from the press, without reaching such distinction as even to excite a murmur among the zealots. The Treatise of Human Nature represents Hume's most thorough development of his philosophical system. In Book I, he examines human understanding, how we form beliefs about causation, the external world, personal identity. In Book II, he analyzes the passions, pride, humility, love, hatred, and the complex mechanisms through which emotions arise. In Book III, he develops his moral theory, showing how virtue and vice are determined by sentiment rather than reason, how justice arises as an artificial virtue, how sympathy serves as the foundation of ethics. Think about the intellectual audacity of this project. Hume proposes to do for the science of mind what Newton did for physics, to discover the fundamental principles governing mental operations through careful observation, to explain all the phenomena of thought and feeling through a small number of basic laws, to build a complete system of human nature on empirical foundations. This is philosophy as science, treating the mind as an object of systematic investigation rather than as a source of a priori truths. The treatise employs Hume's characteristic method: start from experience, analyze what we actually observe rather than what we assume must be true, follow arguments wherever they lead, regardless of how they conflict with traditional views. This method produces conclusions that disturb and unsettle. We discover that causation is not necessary connection, but constant conjunction interpreted through custom. We find that the self is not a substantial soul, but a bundle of perceptions. We learned that morality is grounded in sentiment rather than reason, that justice is artificial rather than natural, that most of what we claim to know rests on psychological mechanisms rather than rational justification. But the treatise's initial audience was not ready for such radical empiricism. Philosophers trained in rationalist systems found Hume's skepticism about reason's power disconcerting. Religious readers recognized, even through Hume's careful circumlocutions, the threatening implications for theological claims. The work's dense, sometimes technical prose made it inaccessible to general readers. And perhaps most problematically, Hume presented his conclusions without the literary grace that would characterize his later works, offering powerful arguments but failing to make them engaging. Consider Hume's response to this failure. Rather than abandoning philosophy or defending the treatise, he rewrote its main arguments in more accessible forms. The Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding covers the first book's topics with greater clarity and polish. The Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals presents the moral theory more persuasively. These later works sacrifice some systematic completeness for accessibility, presenting Hume's key ideas in forms that reached broader audiences and generated more discussion. Yet something is lost in this revision. The treatise contains material absent from the later enquiries, the detailed analysis of space and time, the extended treatment of the passions, the candid admission of difficulties with personal identity. It presents Hume's thought in its most complete and uncompromising form, before he learned to soften controversial conclusions or omit arguments that might offend. Modern philosophers often prefer the treatise precisely for this comprehensiveness and honesty, even while acknowledging the enquiry's superior literary quality. The treatise also reveals Hume's philosophical development. In an appendix, he confesses dissatisfaction with his account of personal identity, acknowledging contradictions he cannot resolve. This philosophical modesty, this willingness to admit failure, distinguishes Hume from rationalist system builders who never acknowledge difficulties in their theories. He aspires to systematic philosophy, but remains empiricist enough to recognize when experience fails to support his conclusions. Think about the work's influence despite its initial failure. Though ignored at first, the treatise eventually gained recognition as a philosophical masterpiece. Kant credits Hume with waking him from dogmatic slumber, though Kant knew Hume primarily through the Enquiry. Later philosophers mined the treatise for insights about causation, personal identity, moral psychology, the nature of belief. What seemed dead-born eventually achieved canonical status, recognized as one of the monuments of Western philosophy. The treatise's failure taught Hume important lessons about philosophy's relationship to its audience. Pure technical philosophy, however rigorous, reaches few readers. Effective philosophy must combine intellectual depth with literary grace, must engage readers' interest while challenging their beliefs, must present difficult ideas accessibly without sacrificing accuracy. Hume's later works embody these lessons, achieving the influence the treatise initially lacked while preserving its core insights. Yet the treatise remains essential for understanding Hume's complete philosophical vision. The later works are refinements and popularizations, excellent in their way but incomplete. The treatise is the full system, ambitious and flawed, comprehensive and sometimes contradictory, presenting human nature in all its complexity through Hume's skeptical empiricist lens. It is philosophy aspiring to be science, observation attempting systematic explanation, skepticism constructing positive theory despite its own doubts about reason's power. What the treatise's initial failure reveals is the gap between philosophical innovation and contemporary reception. The most original ideas often appear strange or threatening when first proposed, requiring time for audiences to adjust, for implications to be recognized, for insights to be integrated into philosophical discourse. Hume's masterwork had to wait for its audience to catch up, for later generations to appreciate what contemporaries could not see. And in this delay between creation and recognition, we find a common pattern in intellectual history that radical innovation often goes unappreciated until those it challenges have passed away. The legacy of empiricism's gentle skeptic, There is a voice that still speaks across centuries, a philosopher whose influence permeates contemporary thought, even when his name goes unmentioned. David Hume died in 1776, reportedly with remarkable calm and good humor, facing death without religious consolation, yet without despair. His final letter to his publisher arranges for posthumous publication of the dialogues concerning natural religion, ensuring his most controversial ideas would reach audiences even after he could no longer be punished for expressing them. And in the centuries since, his philosophical vision has shaped how we think about knowledge, morality, causation, the self, and the limits of human understanding. Hume's empiricism establishes a standard for philosophical method. Begin with experience, trace all ideas to their origins in impressions, reject claims that cannot be grounded in possible observation. This method sounds simple, but proves revolutionary in application. It dissolves traditional metaphysics, showing that claims about substance, necessary connection, and transcendent reality rest on concepts without experiential foundation. It redirects philosophy from speculation about ultimate reality toward investigation of human nature, from asking what we can know about the world in itself to understanding how we actually form beliefs and make judgments. Think about how Hume's skeptical arguments continue to challenge contemporary thought. His problem of induction remains unsolved. We still cannot rationally justify our belief that the future will resemble the past, yet all empirical knowledge depends on this unjustifiable assumption. His analysis of causation still provokes debate. Philosophers continue arguing about whether causation involves more than constant conjunction, whether laws of nature are merely descriptions of regularities, whether we can observe necessary connections. His bundle theory of the self anticipates contemporary neuroscience's rejection of a unified conscious subject. The legacy extends beyond technical philosophy into practical domains. Hume's sentimentalism influences modern moral psychology, which increasingly recognizes emotion's centrality in moral judgment. His account of artificial virtue illuminates how social conventions solve coordination problems, influencing game theory and institutional economics. His naturalistic approach to religion anticipates cognitive science of religion, which studies religious belief as a natural product of human psychology rather than as revelation of transcendent truth. Consider how Hume's moderate skepticism provides a model for intellectual life. We acknowledge what we cannot know while accepting the natural beliefs that guide practical life. We recognize reason's limits while employing it effectively within its proper domain. We remain open to evidence and argument while understanding that absolute certainty is impossible regarding matters of fact. This balanced skepticism, neither dogmatic nor paralyzing, characterizes good thinking across disciplines. Hume also influences how we understand science. His empiricism establishes that scientific knowledge cannot achieve demonstrative certainty, that all scientific claims remain provisional and subject to revision. Yet he shows that this fallibilism need not undermine science's value. Custom and experience provide practical certainty sufficient for action and prediction, even without logical proof. Science progresses through observation and inductive inference, building increasingly reliable but never final knowledge of natural regularities. The tension between Hume's skeptical arguments and his natural beliefs illuminates a fundamental feature of human cognition. Philosophically, we can show that many basic beliefs lack rational justification. Psychologically, we cannot help holding these beliefs anyway. Nature is too strong for philosophical arguments. This recognition shifts philosophy's task from proving beliefs to understanding why we hold them despite their rational unjustifiability, from epistemology as justification to epistemology as naturalized psychology. Think about Hume's influence on later philosophers. Kant develops his critical philosophy in direct response to Hume's skepticism, attempting to show that some synthetic, a priori knowledge is possible despite empiricist objections. Logical positivists radicalize Hume's empiricism, insisting that all meaningful claims must be either analytic or empirically verifiable. Contemporary naturalists continue Hume's project of explaining mental phenomena through observation rather than a priori theorizing. Even philosophers who reject empiricism must engage Hume's arguments. His moral philosophy proves particularly enduring. The is-ought problem he identifies remains a fundamental challenge for moral theory. His sentimentalism anticipates contemporary moral intuitionism and emotivism. His account of sympathy prefigures empathy's role in moral psychology. His distinction between natural and artificial virtues illuminates differences between instinctive and conventional aspects of morality. And his naturalistic ethics, grounding morality in human nature rather than transcendent commands, remains influential in secular moral theory. What makes Hume's legacy particularly rich is the combination of skeptical rigor and philosophical modesty. He demolishes pretensions to knowledge we do not possess while acknowledging the natural beliefs we cannot help holding. He shows reason's limits while recognizing its value within those limits. He attacks bad arguments without claiming to have discovered ultimate truth. This combination of intellectual boldness and humility makes him a model for philosophical inquiry. Consider also Hume's literary achievement. He writes philosophy that can be read with pleasure, not merely studied with effort. His essays on aesthetics, politics, economics, and history reach audiences beyond professional philosophers. He demonstrates that philosophical depth need not require impenetrable prose, that difficult ideas can be presented clearly and even elegantly. This accessibility ensures that his ideas reach beyond academic circles into broader intellectual culture. The gentle skeptic's legacy lies not in founding a school or establishing a system, but in providing methods and insights that continue generating philosophical work. His problem of induction stimulates ongoing epistemology. His analysis of causation informs philosophy of science. His moral sentimentalism influences ethics. His skeptical arguments about the self engage philosophers of mind. His religious skepticism shapes philosophical theology. Across diverse domains, Hume's questions remain live, his arguments remain powerful, his insights remain provocative. As we drift toward rest with these thoughts, we might reflect on what Hume teaches about intellectual life. Be modest in claims, skeptical of dogma, attentive to experience, honest about uncertainty, follow arguments wherever they lead, even to uncomfortable conclusions. Recognize reason's power and limitations. Accept that much we believe cannot be proven yet serves us well. And maintain, through all this, the gentle humor that characterized Hume himself, the recognition that we are curious creatures, blessed and burdened with minds capable of questioning everything while unable to doubt what nature compels us to believe. The legacy endures because the questions persist, because human understanding still operates within the limits Hume identified, because we remain the beings he so carefully studied, empirical yet skeptical, rational yet led by passion, free yet determined, seeking certainty yet living with doubt. Thank you for wandering with me through these questions tonight. If these reflections stayed with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm always curious about your perspective. You'll find more journeys waiting on this channel, stories meant to keep you company in the quiet hours. If you'd like to walk further with us, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, may your thoughts carry you gently into rest.